study, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the second day of our public information gathering for the National Academy's Committee on Impacts on Shipping and Commercial, Tribal, and Recreational Fisheries from the Development of Renewable Energy on the West Coast. So thank you all for joining us. The agenda we'll put up in a moment, and we're continuing to gather information. We'll begin with a panel hearing about fisheries and offshore energy planning in Oregon, followed by a recreational fishery perspective. And then after lunch, we'll hear about the offshore renewable energy development and conclude with a public comment period. So that will be the public comment period will be from 2 to 3 p.m. All are welcome to comment. We just like you to keep your topics related to our statement of facts. So with that, we'll begin with hearing about fisheries and offshore renewable energy planning here in Oregon. And we have actually 3 speakers today. We'll begin with Jessica Watson, then Andy Lanier, and Jeff Barrett. I'll introduce each as we go along. We'll have time for questions immediately following the talks because there's always things that come to mind right away. And then hopefully we'll have time for addressing all 3 panelists at the end. So with that, we begin with Jessica from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and she'll speak on their marine resource policies.
Yeah, thanks everyone. So I'm here today to talk about Oregon's fisheries and kind of the offshore renewable energy development process. Next slide, I'm not sure if you know. All right, thanks. So I first want to start off with a little bit about me. And as you can see from this picture, most of my time as the marine policy project leader with the Marine Resource Program at Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife is spent with different groups discussing policy impacts to fisheries, including offshore wind. I also represent ODFW on the Pacific Fishery Management Council's Marine Planning Committee. But enough about that. Let's get into also ODFW's role for those who are not aware. So kind of who we are in this space is ODFW really acts as an advisory role. We provide input to the state and federal agencies that issue permits or authorizations, and our input serves to advance our mission, which is to protect and enhance Oregon's fish and wildlife and their habitats for the use and enjoyment for now and future generations. And we have a very broad responsibility for species, habitat, and fisheries. So what we do is we apply our policies to inform responsible development with the goal of avoiding or minimizing, to the extent that we can, those impacts. And where we do this work is we consider impacts from ocean energy, not just limited to our state's territorial sea, but we also consider potential effects to coastal resources that could stem from the development in deeper waters and also onshore. Next slide. So what are some of the potential impacts to fisheries that we're considering? So we're definitely considering displacement and exclusion from productive fishing areas. For Oregon, much of the fishing effort displaced from offshore wind development would likely increase fishing effort in other areas that are already fully used by other existing fishery participants. And this could cause fishery conflicts and loss of fishing business efficiencies. We're also interested in potential impacts to fishery compression. With this compression of available fishing grounds, there may be an increase in conflicts within and between different various fishing sectors due to the operational logistics of the gear being used, as well as the spatial distribution of the target species. Some compression can also lead to effort concentration that could cause localized depletion of fish stocks, or also increased interactions with bycatch. And this could necessitate the need for future management measures. We also are considering potential impacts of operational concerns. This is, increased conflicts of how gear operates with other gear, so gear damage or loss, and other factors like transit times to and from fishing grounds. Also, we're considering potential impacts of disruption to some of the long-term scientific surveys by limiting access to the sampling sites. and introducing potential sampling bias and reducing sampling productivity. Disruption to some of the National Marine Fisheries Service surveys could have cascading effects on commercial fishery management. So we need an accurate and comprehensive survey data to inform our stock assessments and our fishery management decisions. Also, there's potential for impacts of restricting access to port infrastructure. Fisheries are dependent on port infrastructure like processing facilities. So losing that temporary access to these ports and facilities from direct or indirect offshore wind development activities could be particularly impactful to vessels that operate outside of those ports and the communities that depend on those facilities. This would also potentially have impacts to other facilities in the major ports in Oregon, Washington and California, which might need to adjust operations to accommodate the landings from vessels which port access has been limited. So an important part really in addressing the impacts is through appropriate siting, which is where ODFW has really worked hard throughout this process in Oregon to make sure that fisheries are considered, and what I'll really kind of be focusing a little bit of the rest of the talk on. This work started in earnest in 2014 and 2015 with the Wind Float project, but that was before my time. So I have backup here, so Ellie can speak to that process. And I'll be focusing more on the BOEM process for the offshore wind siting, and how we started to include fisheries data in a little bit more of a sophisticated way. Next slide. So just setting the stage, I'm sure you're all aware of the process, but just for Oregon, it was a little bit different. The first step in the BOEM process was to call for information for site call areas off of Oregon. This included the consideration of the Oregon offshore wind planning area in 2020, which spanned the entirety of the Oregon coast. Originally, BOEM proposed 3 call areas, one in Coos, one in Bandon, and one off Brookings. But based on feedback from the Oregon task force, BOEM moved only forward 2 call areas in Coos and Brookings in 2022. The next part of the process was citing the wind energy areas, and Oregon was for the first time in which BOEM added a draft wind energy area phase to the process, which was addressing Oregon's requests for slowing down the process in 2023. And then we had our final RIAs that were identified. And throughout this process, ODFW has acknowledged that there are no areas off the Oregon coast that are not actively used by one or multiple fisheries, which presents a significant challenge for siting offshore wind responsibly. Therefore, we've been actively engaged throughout this process to provide information on fishing footprints and potential impacts to offshore wind siting to help avoid and minimize impacts to fisheries while still seeking to meet our state energy goals. So now I'll walk you through kind of the evolution of the fisheries data that we've provided to inform offshore wind siting and some lessons learned as well. Next slide. So when BOEM first put out the call for information to site call areas off Oregon, ODFW staff really asked ourselves, what's the best way to represent spatial importance of fisheries to help reduce impacts through overlap with development? So we looked at the fisheries data that we had access to at the time, given the time frame that we had to respond to this call for information. And we created kernel density heat maps for each fishery, which were made publicly available on a wind map, as shown here on the right. Some limitations of this method were we only had the time to include effort information, and so we were missing the revenue information in these maps. And given the time constraints, we did not have similar representation of the same temporal scale between the fisheries, and we didn't have a way really to combine them given the time to look at all of the fisheries combined. So the lessons that we learned in this process was that we needed to immediately start developing collaborative partnerships to make sure we could provide more complete information on both effort and revenue as the siting process continued, knowing that we were going to be under tight timeframes. Next slide. So the next part of the siting process was the draft wind energy areas. So taking wind energy areas down from call areas. And as I mentioned, Oregon was the first time in which BOEM added these draft WIAs to the process. Also, based on request, BOEM partnered with NOAA's National Center for Coastal Ocean Sciences, NCOS, group to conduct a suitability model, which used multiple data sets to identify areas of least conflict in the call areas. So as part of that process, ODFW formed a collaborative partnership with the National Marine Fisheries Service to provide technical assistance in developing the fisheries submodel for BOEM's spatial suitability model being developed by NACO to identify those draft WIAs. And I want to take a moment just to recognize the team that worked really hard on this effort, which includes my NIMS colleagues, Kelly Andrews and Blake Feist, and former NIMS collaborator, Lila Ise, and my fellow ODFW members, Justin Ainsworth and Delia Kelly, as well as our former ODFW program leader, Karen Brady. And our goal here was really to accurately represent West Coast fisheries, and this meant the inclusion of both effort and revenue data to create fishery-specific and combined maps to be used in this spatial suitability process. And we included fisheries that had spatial data that could be acquired and analyzed within the short time period that we were given. Next slide. So there's a lot on this table, but this table really represents the fisheries data that we used in this process. In total, we considered 11 fisheries that were operating in the vicinity of the call areas. So we just looked at the call areas alone, not at the entire coast. And we ended up including 9 of those fisheries, which are depicted in this table on the left-hand slide. We did not include salmon or directed halibut fisheries due to spatial data limitations and time constraints. CPS fisheries operate inshore of the call areas, so those were also not included. And recreational fisheries we did not have the spatial data available for, except for the Albacore charter fleet. So that's the only recreational-esque data set that was included in this. The rows in this table are the fisheries, and you'll see there's both green and yellow. The yellow really represents that fishing effort, and the green is the revenue. And there's also some dots there, and those represent fisheries in years we had info for all 3 West Coast states. And where there's no dots, that's where fishing events that occurred in the call areas were just landed in Oregon. So that's a little bit different there. This data came from logbooks and observer data, and then was matched with PACFIN ticket data for revenue. Next slide. So the first step in this process is that we just took a look at the data in the way in which the NCOS model would be depicting the data based on suitability to offshore wind development. Where the cooler colors like blue indicate suitability with offshore wind development, and warmer colors, yellows and oranges, indicate that less suitable areas due to overlap with fisheries. And as you can see in this map, it didn't look like we expected. We know that the entire area is used by fisheries, but that wasn't really being represented. And so we asked ourselves why that was. And this caused us to really explore some of the data distributions more closely. Next slide. So here showing some raw effort for the at-sea hake fishery, but what we found was that the data contained really high values, which ended up de-emphasizing the spaces used by the fisheries. So in this plot, you can see that the small area in red right there at the bottom was really increasing the scale so much that the rest of the space looked like there wasn't much effort happening. So we went back to the drawing board and to make sure that effort and revenue could be used to best represent the area important to fisheries. So we needed to account for that skewness in the distribution, and did that through using a ranked method. This method ranks the importance of each grid cell and creates a more even distribution. Next slide. So as you can see, that took us from our raw effort data to the ranked effort data on the right. And it really brought out more of the importance of the cells. And you can see from the plot on the right. And we applied this method, which we called the ranked importance, to all fisheries for both effort and revenue. Then we wanted to make sure we could combine effort and revenue data for each fishery, and fisheries combined with each other. So we used a normalizing process, which just pretty much takes everything and puts it in zeros and ones so you can add it together. And that would give us our combined fishery revenue and effort footprints. Next slide. So instead of the state and federal fisheries managers providing BOEM and NCOS with the map on the left, as passive data providers, we've actively engaged in this process to create the map on the right, which we were able to share with the fishing communities as part of the Pacific Fishery Management Council process to allow feedback and to get feedback on how that was representing their fisheries. The lessons learned was that it's really important to have fisheries managers as part of this process and fisheries experts as part of this process in general. ODFW and NIMS working together not only produced a method to combine effort and revenue data, but also that relative ranked importance to make sure outliers or areas with high effort or revenue do not reduce the importance of fishing grounds overall. But with all of the modeling, it's still really important component in all of this work has been communicating the data limitations of this method clearly to stakeholders. And so we have definitely acknowledged that, you know, there's a limitation in displaying temporal variability right now with the maps that we provided. We also acknowledge that there's still data gaps for certain fisheries that we weren't able to include based on limitations in spatial information or limitations in temporal time of pulling that information together. And we also acknowledge that no model is perfect. But by having these maps, we were able to begin having those conversations with the fishing communities. Next slide. One more. Yeah, and I just want to note here, this process was highlighted in a case study in Harvey et al. Or that was published earlier this year. So I just want to highlight that as well, that you can find more details to this entire process there. Next slide. Okay, so lessons learned is that with more time, information can be developed to inform the siting process to potentially reduce impacts to fisheries. So throughout the entire BOEM process in Oregon, we were on really quick, tight timelines, which led to data gaps and limitations in the information being used in the siting process. One data gap that was identified had to do with the lack of ecosystem indicators in the NCOS suitability model. However, our partners since that at NIMS and the California or the CCIEA, which is the California, there we go, Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team. For the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team, acronyms this morning, have continued to develop these ecosystem indicators as part of their California Current Ecosystem Status Report, which is depicted here on the right. So they've looked at exploring potential indicators like upwelling, front indexes, primary productivity, secondary productivity, young of the year for rockfish and hake, and juvenile groundfish habitat, and as well as combining all of those indicators into like a combined ecosystem indicator layer. And this data can be found in that report under Appendix U. Additionally, filling fishery data gaps will be important next steps, especially for recreational fisheries throughout Oregon waters, as well as thinking about this more in a coast-wide perspective of the inshore fisheries outside of the call areas. We've really focused on the call areas, but thinking about the coast in its entirety for the different phases of developmental processes. So thinking about cabling or how would that look if we were looking at some of our inshore fisheries. And also just more collaboration needed on the West Coast to think about these impacts. Oregon fleets operate in Oregon, Washington, and California, so collaborating for a West Coast wide look of siting is really important to kind of avoid and minimize those potential impacts. And we at ODFW could not have done all this work without our strong partnership also with our National Marine Fisheries Service colleagues. So we're continuing those partnerships as part of and also adding to those partnerships with the addition of the Pacific State Marine Fisheries Commission in partnership with BOEM and the other states and our region and science center partners for the PAC-FEM tool. And this project, once completed, can be used to also inform some of the socioeconomic impact discussions here. So it would be a tool that's online both for resource managers and for the public to look at how putting locations in the ocean, which fisheries would be impacted. So kind of a spatial tool as well. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Okay, I'll lead off.
Okay.
While people put their, when did you start your mapping process? Was that as soon as you got the draft of wind energy areas from BOEM or, and then from a times perspective, what's kind of the order of magnitude? How much time did you have before BOEM started keying in on the specific?
So I would say we first started just thinking about how we wanted to include fisheries back in 2014 and 15. But the mapping process really began in 2020 with that call for information for the entire coast. And again, we're talking kind of months to provide the information. And then when it came to the WIAs and the draft list of going from call areas to WIAs, we started that process. 22, and we had probably 6 months, maybe 3 months.
Are you talking about the NCOS assessment?
Yeah.
That was more like 6 weeks.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Site.
So really tight.
Yeah. Can I just add, the little wind map link that Jessica mentioned, if y'all aren't familiar with that,
Yeah.
that's all still available online. And the beginning of the BOEM process for Oregon was all about setting up this website so that everybody could do their own assessment of various layers. And so the heat map approach was sort of our first, like, how do we bring complex data into that space? And then refining it even, higher resolution for the second.
And both those, all those maps are included in our quick map under the different sections too.
Okay, thank you. We have questions from Jeremy, then Dave, and Mike Mark.
I have just a question on the GIS mapping. So the one on the left was sort of about the distribution of the data.
Mm-hmm.
And then the one on the right, you put into like deciles or something like that.
Explain that. It's complicated, yeah.
How you went from one
Yep.
to the next.
So I didn't want to go too in the weeds, but let's go in. So the one on the left, which was pretty like mostly cool colors with those, a couple of red.
Right.
So how we went from that side to the ranked is each 2x2 grid cell was ranked based on how many grid cells were there. So if there's 1,100 grid cells, the one with the highest is ranked 1, and it moves down in effort, which took our skewed distribution where there were just like a handful of cells and redistributed so that you could still see that in that bottom corner, it's still really important. But relative to the next important cell of effort number, so like, let's say 200 hours versus 150 hours is the next one, or let's say 50 hours is the next one, that you would see 200 is cell 1, it gets this. 50 is cell 2, it's the next highest, and so that's how that ranking occurs. It just redistributes it. But they're still in relation to each other.
It's like a non-parametric analysis rather.
Yeah. And I guess question why you have more confidence in the one on the right, than the one on the left. So if, let's just say in 5 of the grid cells out of the 1,100, 90% of the fishing effort is occurring, 90% of the revenues is occurring, then that may be that we don't need to be that concerned if there's a wind project in the other portion of the WIA.
Yeah, and
But because you also said you only presented the fishers with the one on the right versus the one on the left. And so the question is, are we better off providing people with more information and more ways of looking at the data so that they can come to their own conclusions?
yeah, so we definitely provided, when we presented this to the Pacific Fishery Management Council, we provided both, right? So we showed, here's what the raw data looks like, here's what our ranked data looks like. I think the importance here is that we're thinking about the fishery overall. And some of those areas that are being downplayed based on like really high effort are still really important to some fishers. And so we wanted to make sure that we were accurately representing the fishery as a whole of the use of that area. And just because that area isn't necessarily getting the highest rank of effort or revenue doesn't mean that it's also really important to a single vessel or several vessels for that. So that's why we have both of those.
And then do you have these kind of maps by species too? So,
We just did them by fishery.
okay, and did you, I don't know how much there's a sessile fishery off the coast of Oregon versus mobile. Because There's obviously large differences in sighting in places where there's successful fish species and where there's mobile fishery.
Yeah, so we used, this is also cumulative over the cumulative effort, cumulative revenue over that duration of time for the data set. And I think that what we were noticing too is that you could have, in some fisheries, you also have variability based on temporal scale, right? Certain years,
Yeah.
the distribution changes and shifts, which is different than a sessile fishery might have the same distribution in the same areas, but some of these patterns held true of like certain locations are really important to the trawl fishery every year in the winter time. And so that's kind of where they go and target some of their species.
Yeah, so is there, I
Jessica,
think there may be like an abalone fishery off the.
well, I think what also you should highlight is that this is just one fishery.
Yes,
This is just the at-sea
yes.
whiting fishery.
Okay.
Not the one that comes shoreside, not all of
Okay,
the
this
other
is just a
commercial.
single fish.
It's just
This is
one
not-
fish.
Okay, sorry, I
Thank-
wasn't.
thank you,
Thank
thank
you,
you.
Michelle.
Yeah.
I was unclear, so that
No.
answers my question.
Yeah, we have
We can-
one of these mass for each of the fisheries.
Let's see, Dave.
Thank you. I have two questions. One is, it sounds like Bohm presented you with the call areas. And the question is, would you have preferred that the coast was open and you worked with Bohm to decide on where the call area should be? The second question is, were there any benefits that were identified by the Oregon Department of Fisheries and Wildlife to the offshore wind areas if they were closed, for instance, to fishing, like an MPA and furtherance of reproductive success and all that sort of stuff, but not reproductive success, but reproduction. Were there any benefits that were
Considered.
considered? Yeah.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, and I think we were at the time. We would have liked, we focused in using these mapping methods just for the call areas, and I think it would have been a very useful exercise to look at the entire coast with those types of maps at play. And thinking about all the different types of species, because these are also just the fishery submodels. There's also a lot of natural resources maps that went into this. And so I think using that end cost approach coastwide would have been really informative to see if the call areas landed where they did.
The reason I ask is that yesterday we were talking about Packwave, I think it was, and they said the fishermen identified places, I think it was Packwave, where the devices should be sited, you know, without even considering, regulatory agencies, let's say.
Yeah.
And the question is, maybe that's not pertinent to this our discussion or preview here, but would it have been useful to have the things wide open and you worked with Bohm to decide where the area should be?
Yeah, I think it would have been useful to look at the entire area with some of these maps.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's fine. It's,
Yeah, and then also to then think about too, like the fisheries having feedback on that discussion as well.
so is there any benefit to you? Geez,
Oh,
just look-
Closed areas. I don't have any information of like the benefit right now. That's not something we really looked into. Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay, next up, Michael and then Rebecca.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica, and to Dave's point, I think one of the recommendations that came out of the Pacific Fisheries Management Council was to rescind the call areas, apply this methodology across the entirety of the EZ up Oregon to determine if the two areas identified were the optimal areas. But that wasn't chosen. You know, I mean, when we first saw this, I think our minds were somewhat blown away. And it was welcomed by the fishing community. Not everybody was, I don't wanna sit here and say that it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. It's great. There were some fisheries, the albacore fishery, for example, is one that, you know, if you look at the heat map for the albacore fishery, it did fall within the areas that were identified as final areas, but the ability to make that kind of holistic determination, looking at the 9 fisheries that you looked at. So my question to you is, I know that before Lila left, she was engaging with California on doing something similar. Do you have any sort of insight on where they are with this?
I think we were looking at like large collaborations of doing this entire process West Coast wide. To the point previously of like, not even just looking at Oregon, but how can we look at this West Coast wide? Is
Sure.
that appropriate?
Sure.
So that I think was what we were intending to do. I think the PACFEM tool has potential there to look at West Coast wide. But how that process will move forward in the current state is still to be seen.
Yeah, no, that's always been one of the concerns raised is, when they're looking at these projects, they're looking at them in silos. Like they're looking at the 2 Oregon wind energy areas, they're looking at the 5 California lease sites. Yet if you look at what the plans are federally in the state, I mean, what I think we've seen from DOE upwards of 45 gigawatts off the West Coast by 2045. And, using the tools that you mentioned here, take a holistic look at, okay, what would that look like? We just haven't got to that point yet. It's hopefully that's something that will be picked up.
Yeah, and the IEA team with their ecosystem indicators are also West Coast wide. So it's available. We could apply it, just need to have the capacity.
Okay, good. We have 3 more questions, then we'll move on to the next speaker. So Rebecca, then Tracy, then Robert. And Rebecca.
Hello, can you hear me? Oh, good. So I might just be amplifying a point but I wanted to circle back on it. And Jessica, I appreciate you sort of breaking down the work that you were able to do really quickly. I think the point is, it's important to recognize that there are multiple ways of using these data. Jessica was presenting one way that they were able to quickly do. What I heard you say, Jessica, is the importance of, just like we're doing with the oceanographic characteristics, being able to come up with a collective way of looking at multiple fisheries. The ranked effort is one way. It's obviously, I know you were working very quickly, but not the only way of analyzing and incorporating these data. And I'm guessing that your process, it sounds like you were sort of alluding to we were pressed for time, here's what we were able to deliver. It's challenging looking across fisheries, coming up with like common metrics of effort. I totally, after spending decades and decades on this, totally recognize that. So I'm imagining your team is eager, as you said, to sort of look up coast-wide, both methodologically and data comprehensively.
Yes, and include more fisheries as well. So like I mentioned, we just considered 11 fisheries total and then only included 9 fisheries, but we didn't even include any of the fisheries that weren't operating in the vicinity of the call areas, which we know that as this offshore wind installation development process moves forward, we'll also want to have information on our near shore fisheries as well, the potential impacts. So yeah, and
As well as,
also,
sorry, you go.
No, just as well as all the other components, right? So this is just fisheries, and to your point, there's a lot of other natural resources we would also be considering, like habitat types and
Or
protected species.
recruitment sites, right? And I know someone mentioned that as well, that support these fisheries, which could also be impacted by the development, right? As we not think of just the areas where towers are, but, moving through how those, are being connected to land. So, yeah.
Exactly.
But thanks for sharing that. That was great.
Okay, Tracy.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the presentation. I take it based on a comment you made that this didn't really incorporate a lot of recreational fishermen data. Can you just talk more about what you did have and if you have any ideas moving forward about?
Yeah, so with the recreational data, the only proxy we had was logbook, spatial data from logbook charter albacore data. So that's what we used. Again, also thinking about which recreational fisheries would be operating that far offshore. But there are some, right? So we didn't have the spatial information to include that, but that's something that we definitely identified as a data gap and would be really interested in having more conversations on how we can incorporate recreational data into these types of methods and models and just consideration. For our public comments, we understand how important recreational fishery is to the state of Oregon and to coastal communities and the revenue it brings in. So we definitely want to make sure it's continued to be considered for potential impacts.
Okay, and then I'll ask the same question about tribal fisheries. Do you have any information on what tribes were doing?
So we didn't have any information of what the tribes were doing. I mean, for the data set. Right.
Thank you.
No, back up, yes, ma'am. All right, well, thank you, Jessica. Will please stay around for our panel questions. But next up is Andy Lanier. He's Marine Affairs Coordinator with Oregon's Coastal Management Plan. Andy?
Yeah, good morning. Do you want me to share my screen or are you going to share the presentation and I'll say next?
I can share it if you want.
Sure. Get ready because I got a lot of slides, so I'm going to go quickly through them. And unlike Jessica, I'm going to give a little bit more of the historical context of the development of Oregon's ocean policy as it relates to marine renewable energy. So next slide. So as I was thinking about the prompts for today, I came away with kind of 3 key points. One of which is that demands on ocean space are only growing. In the history of the policy development in the state of Oregon, we have seen that consistently. People are always thinking about new ways to use the ocean. Recognizing, though, that we have had a longstanding human community that's out there in our fisheries and in our marine transportation ecosystem. So permanent structures placed in the water are a direct impact to the potential compatible uses of ocean space. Full stop. Whether or not it's renewable energy or scientific instrumentation or offshore oil and gas, if you are placing a structure in the water column, that does have a direct impact on the other ocean users. And over time, Oregon has developed policies to reduce the impacts and to maximize the compatible uses of ocean space. And I will talk about how the state kind of came to that policy and how we think about that policy as it develops our plans and as it moves forward. Next slide. And it may be simplistic to think about, but our commercial fishing systems off the Oregon coast are mostly mobile, right? We have bottom trawling and midwater trawling, and some of our largest catch by volume include species like whiting and hake, which are mostly mobile. And these are methods of fishing which rely on potentially miles of behind a boat where a net is dragging through the water column. And if you think about the logistics of trying to avoid an obstruction in the water column when you've got a line behind your boat that's a couple of miles long, that is challenging. So any piece of infrastructure, they're going to have to plan early to move around. It is going to be an obstruction. We do also have, traps and pot fisheries. Probably our biggest by volume, or biggest by economic input to the coast is Dungeness crab, most of which are a pot-based fishery. But even those systems and even those methods move. They're not intended to move, but because of the oceanographic conditions off of our coast, they can move. And so infrastructure in the water can get tangled on them, causing risks to other organisms through secondary entanglement and causing risks and damage of loss of gear to the fishermen who are laying those pots out there. Next slide, please. And lastly, if you think about kind of the ecosystem that is our human use of the ocean, Oregon has an estuary management classification where we have deep draft estuaries classified. We have 3 of them. They are on the Columbia River, the Yaquina Bay, and Coos Bay. For the other estuaries on the coast, the next deepest would be shallow draft systems. And those systems just don't support as much industrial development, processing, or kind of economic input from the ocean. So there's a little bit lesser system. And as we think about the at-sea use of our ocean space, they are dependent upon the pathways to and from these ports. And when it was mentioned earlier in your meeting that there's a towboat tug agreement, that's a voluntary agreement, that was a great example and a model of the fact that Oregon has promoted a compatible use of ocean space by saying that crabbers will not place their pots in those tow lanes, and the towboat operators will stay in those lanes so that they don't get entangled in the crab gear that's often very dense, very near shore. So an excellent example of co-use of ocean space in different seasons, where some of those tow lanes are in effect, and multiple uses of the ocean being developed. Next slide, please. So I work for the Oregon Coastal Management Program. It's a networked program through the Coastal Zone Management Act. We work with a network of state agencies and local partners that help to implement our plans. The ocean, however, being kind of a commons and not a part of our land, is administered by the state. So we have a little bit more authority and a little bit more decision-making in the ocean. What authority we do have comes through to us from federal consistency. So that is the federal consistency provisions of the Coastal Zone Management Act that allow us to apply state policies where we have approved policies and plans to activities being proposed by federal government. And we get our policies and plans from our coastal goals, the Territorial Sea Plan, as well as other plans like estuary management plans or hazard planning. Next slide. So I'm going to take us in the Wayback Machine to understand kind of the history of our program. So our program was approved in 1977. It followed a number of years of work by Oregon Coastal Conservation and Development Commission, which was tasked with coming together and developing some sort of a coastal resource management plan because we were having unchecked development on land, especially in places like Lincoln City. Following that commission, we had the establishment of Senate Bill 100, which put our state's land use planning program into place, and DLCD as the administrator of that program. The coastal goals, which were established, make up kind of the foundational coastal zone management policies that the state upholds, and those coastal goals were incorporated into our program. I'll talk a little bit more about those later. But the first real phase of work after the establishment of our coastal program was in how are our agencies going to coordinate and what are the ocean uses that are being proposed that we need to respond to. And much to my chagrin, our state's policymakers back when I was still in the womb, were talking about the threat of offshore oil and gas development off of our coast and potentially have heavy mineral mining or critical minerals that were potentially available off of the Gorda Ridge. So a lot of the activity that happened in the early policy development of our program was focused around what is the state's response to this proposed new use. And that led to things like our first Oregon Ocean book being published. That was kind of a first atlas where we look at the system of upwelling and how that system is interdependent with many other uses. That led to a territorial sea management study, a working group. Next slide, please. And in 1987, we had an ocean resources task force that was created. And it developed the first Oregon Ocean Resources Management Plan. We shortened that to the Ocean Plan. And that really was the first comprehensive resources inventory that our state program put into place. Through that work, we did develop and codify in law our statutory Oregon Ocean Resources Management Program that included the creation of the Ocean Policy Advisory Council, which still to this day works with my agency commission to steward our territorial sea plan, the first iteration of which was adopted in 1994. Next slide, please. So the territorial sea plan and all of that original ocean policy work is all based upon our foundational goal 19 related to ocean resources. And that goal explicitly states that it's the state's policy to conserve the long-term values, benefits, and natural resources of the nearshore ocean and the continental shelf. And it sets out a set of policy priority preferences on how the state is actually going to meet those goals. it says in particular that we are going to give higher priority to the protection of renewable marine resources than to the development of non-renewable ocean resources. And we've been asked as a state, well, doesn't marine renewable energy development qualify as a renewable resource? And the state's answer was, it is still development, and it's not something that is crucial to the function of our ecosystem. So we don't think of those things as being equal. Goal 19 recognizes that to protect the diversity of our marine life, the functions of our ecosystems and our habitats, that is really the foundational principle that is going to deliver ecologic and economic health and prosperity to the state of Oregon. And so we strive to manage our resources consistent with that goal. Next slide, please. This is a list of the agencies that work with our agency to administer our ocean program. They are the state agencies that have some regulatory or jurisdictional role in the management of marine resources. I'm not going to go through all these, but I will say that they include the Department of State Lands, which covers kind of the 0 to 3 nautical miles out in our territorial sea. So anybody who's digging, anybody who's doing removal fill activities has to work through our Department of State Lands. And that is actually the hook by which we apply the territorial sea plan to all of kind of the development activities that are likely to occur. You've heard a presentation from Jessica from ODF&W. They are our experts that help us understand the impacts to our ecosystems and our fisheries. Our Parks and Recreation Department owns the beach, and they administer anything that crosses the ocean shore. So when you heard about cables being horizontally directionally drilled under the ocean shore, that required a state Parks and Recreation Department permit. Department of Environmental Quality helps us think about things like oil spills and impacts of activities related to pollution or the discharge into marine waters. Our Department of Geology and Mineral Industries helps us understand seismic hazards, mineral extraction, etc. So these are just a few of the agencies we work with, and they are all represented on the Ocean Policy Advisory Council as need be to help us work through issues that come to the state. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go back. I mentioned the ocean plan previously as our ocean policy was being developed, but I really wanted to take some time to highlight this because this very crude map was one of the products of Oregon's first ocean geographic information system. This was kind of put together in the last half of the 1980s. And it is really the first atlas of ocean uses that I've been able to discover. And right here you see some substrate or sediment types associated with cores. And most of the activity to understand the system was centered on the shelf. So not a lot of activity in coring down on the slope or abyssal plain. Next slide. But in addition to understanding kind of the geology, we do have our first kind of fisheries information maps. So these are all rockfish fishery information maps. They're created, I think, in partnership with our Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, again, way back in the day. So, again, forgive the crudeness of these maps, but they show really, the effort of our bottom trawling industry and midwater trawling industry that was targeting rockfish at the time. Next slide. We also have information about some of the other flatfish. Again, you can see most of the activity is kind of near the shelf, and there certainly is some deviation in amount of effort or catch landed. Next slide, please. So moving on now into kind of the actions of ocean planning in the 2000s and forward, the state continued to respond to challenges of management, in particular, the adoption of Territorial Sea Plan Part 4, uses of the seafloor, occurred in 2000. That was really in response to the first fiber optic cable applications that came to the state. And you heard others yesterday describe the fact that burial is required out on the territorial sea. This, was an agreement between the two industries, our fishing industry and the cable industry, so that compatible uses of the ocean could be maximized. In the kind of late 2000s all the way to 2019, that was the period of time within which, the state was considering the development of Part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan. And this is what I will spend a lot of my effort talking next on, which is how did the state consider marine renewable energy or hydrokinetic wave power relative to our existing policies. We've continued to make amendments and improvements to the Territorial Sea Plan. As recently as 2023, we adopted amendments to both our Rocky Habitat Management Strategy and Part 4 of the Territorial Sea Plan. Next slide. So here's just a very quick look at, the contents of the Territorial Sea Plan as it stands today. And all of these are hyperlinked, so if you're interested afterwards, you can go and look at these sections of our plan. Next slide. But to take us to the topic of marine renewable energy, why would we amend the TSP for marine renewable energy? Well, the first matter of fact is we started having permits issued for wave energy development in 2007, 2008 by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in state waters without any sort of state input by companies that were asking that federal regulatory agency for the ability to use ocean space. And while the state recognized that we have an interest in the development of renewable energy, we also wanted to have a plan that would understand and protect the resources and the uses and balance those as best we could. And so we asked for a pause in the issuance of those permits by FERC, and we committed to developing a plan so that we would be able to understand the potential impacts of wave energy on our nearshore ocean ecosystem. Next slide. And these ones I'm going to be like next. So goal 19, we need to factor in and map and understand ecosystem function and diversity. Next. The areas of importance to fisheries, which I'll highlight in just a moment. Next. The beneficial uses of which cables were identified as one. Next. Research and monitoring was something that we identified. So inventorying where research was occurring historically and consistently in space and time was something we thought about and recognized. And I think we were one of the first states to understand that they were a community that we needed to understand the impacts on, because of investments over time. For example, the Newport hydrographic line has been in place for over 70 or 80 years, and disruptions to that line could mean a disruption to the science that helps us to understand how our ecosystems are performing. Next. Recreation is a key use, and with marine hydrokinetic energy, if you're taking energy out of the waves, you might be impacting the communities that use the waves, for example, like surfers. Next. Certainly marine navigation is something we were concerned about with the placement of devices that could be hazards for navigation. Next. And lastly, the scenic environment, aesthetics. Many Oregonians come to the coast because it is a spiritual experience almost, seeing an environment out there where you don't have permanent structures. Next. So when we were asked to plan for marine renewable energy, and in particular wave, the question that we ended up asking ourselves very frequently was, well, what are we planning for exactly? Because at the time, there was no consolidation, there was no kind of technological readiness at a level that we could understand that there was going to be one type of device that was going to be coming in asking for use of the ocean space. So how could we understand the impacts when you might have devices operated very differently. And so our approach was to look at what our Goal 19 resources are. Go ahead, next slide. And we did this through geospatial analysis. So we created geographic information layers for areas of biological and ecological importance, areas of importance to fisheries, and the other existing uses or beneficial uses that we recognized that Goal 19 said that we had a criteria of needing to protect. And we used kind of the intersection of all those pieces of information to understand areas that were the busiest, most important ecologically, and areas that maybe weren't as busy, so that there would be a more maximum use in some of these other areas. Next slide. So here's where we get to our fisheries uses and values mapping. This was a participatory GIS exercise where we hired EcoTrust as a consultant, and they interviewed people from all of the major ports in the state of Oregon, and they worked directly with that community, and that community produced these maps based upon individual fishermen input into basically a GIS. They were given 100 pennies. They were asked, over the lifetime of your fishing, place these pennies out in the ocean in a way that represents your fishing grounds to the best of your ability. And then they took the input from the fishermen of similar communities and similar ports, and they created port-based maps, and they created sector-based maps. And you can discover and you can look at all of these maps as a way of understanding the fisheries use. And again, this was really targeted at the territorial sea at the time, but we did not limit the input to the territorial sea because we recognize that fisheries don't often abide by the state waters boundary. So we used these maps, and we used a percent volume contour from these maps to identify and delineate the areas of greatest importance to fisheries off our coast and areas of great importance to fisheries. So we had kind of two classes, and those classes were used in the development of our spatial plan. Next slide. So part 5 includes the policies, the preferences, the requirements for implementation if a project were to come to fruition. It includes the plan map that has area designations associated with it, which I'll talk about in a moment, and then a completed resources and uses inventory that was used to generate the plan. So if you're trying to understand marine mammals or seabirds, et cetera, those are mapped resources and uses inventories. Next slide. And the plan map area includes basically a set of zones. They go from areas where there were already something permitted, like the renewable energy permit area that the state had given the early PacWave project, to areas that are going to be excluded from consideration because they have some sort of special management designation, and the rest of which had kind of a sliding scale of difficulty for permitting, depending upon the concentration of the resources or uses that the state had identified. Next slide. So the outcome of this work by the state was that we established policy for the review and evaluation of any potential marine renewable energy project off Oregon. Full stop, period, right? We have not had any commercial project come to the state since the adoption of our plan. And I think that is more of a function of economic market and considerations than it is of anything else. During the time when the plan was being developed in 2010, 11, and 12, the economy was really great. And then we hit a big slump, and interest really took a nosedive. The one exception is that there was the PacWave facility that was proposed offshore outside of state waters. But even that facility had to meet kind of the requirements in state waters for burial of cables to promote that, again, that maximum compatible use of ocean space. And I think with that, you go next slide, and I am done, and we'll take any questions.
I think Andy, we'll wait and take questions after Jeff speaks, so
Yep.
let's go ahead. Thank you very much. Next speaker, Jeff Wright, Oregon's Wind Energy Roadmap Coordinator. Jeff.
Yeah, thank you. Morning, everybody. I work with Andy at Department of Land Conservation and Development in the Oregon Coastal Management Program. And while the slides are coming up, I am coordinating the development of an offshore wind roadmap for the state that came from House Bill 4080 in our last legislative session. We began the process in September of last year. We're actively ongoing, and we're actually trying to get some more time in recognition that things have changed recently, and we have more time to do some of that engagement work. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the roadmap itself, what we're trying to accomplish, and give you a peek behind the curtain at some of the conversations that are emerging out of that process and some of the questions specifically that I am going to be bringing to fishing communities. I'm actually meeting with Oregon Trawl Commission this afternoon to have that first conversation. So I see some parallel paths between what I'm trying to accomplish and what I see as what this task is trying to accomplish. So I want to talk about that. And then I do want to, because my former role at the Oregon Coastal Management Program was as the Federal Consistency Review Coordinator, talk a little bit about how that works as the state's lever and some of the key policies that we would use in a future process. Next, please. So first, House Bill 4080 directed DLCD to lead the development of this offshore wind roadmap for the state. This passed in mid-2024 at a time when it was seen that federal leasing for offshore wind was imminent. And a recognition that the state needed to take some time to get our own house in order, to take a look at our enforceable policies that we use through our federal consistency authority, and to compare those to the standards that we want to have for ourselves as a state when it comes to any future decisions related to offshore wind. So we were tasked with developing the roadmap and also doing this evaluation of our enforceable policies. Go ahead, please. House Bill 4080 specifically directed us to define standards to be considered in any future offshore wind development and approval. And it gave us some topic areas to focus on in our conversation that included effective stakeholder engagement, local and regional coastal communities, which are of course intertwined with fishing as a use, the creation of economic opportunity that's new, as well as sustaining what exists already. And then you can see there, creation of a workforce that is trained, housed, and equitable, protection of tribal interests, protection of the environment and marine species, and also the attainment of our energy and climate goals. I do want to be clear though about what the roadmap will and won't do. The roadmap we see as a way to highlight where we may have some policy gaps as a state, where we may have values, interests, or needs that are not represented in policy. But the roadmap is not the place to create new policy. It is a place where we can make recommendations of areas that need to be considered through formal processes that would come later. We also see the roadmap as an opportunity to be a strategic plan that we can look at those actions the state can take or should take over the next 5-10 years to make best use of that time and be prepared for a future that might or might not include offshore wind. We're also looking at where there are capacity needs at the state and local level to support potential future offshore wind. And then just writ large, what we're basically trying to do with the roadmap is to define the path, to figure out what is that best path for Oregon. But that's different from then deciding to walk that path. Next, please. This is a pictogram of the process that we've been embarking on. I came into this role in September. By November, we had recruited and kicked off a roadmap roundtable representing about 50 different members from a broad range of interests, plus agency advisors, which added another 30 or 40. We've been engaging with tribes, since before our kickoff and have a separate tribal table where we are talking with them about their specific interests while also having an open invitation to the roundtable itself. That roundtable meets monthly, day-long meetings. Our next one is on June 17th down in Florence. And you all want to come with virtual options as well. We've also split out so far 3 working groups. One of them related to Oregon specific research agenda and research coordination. One related to this question of should the state lead our own marine spatial planning? Taking a note from what we heard yesterday from, I believe it was Greg from New York, how state of New York took a look out into federal waters and identified suitable sea space. We're debating the pros and cons of that. And there's also a working group dedicated to the question of community benefits and other enforceable agreements and how those can be part of the process. We're doing some focus group engagement as well that is just getting rolling. And we've been doing some public meetings as well, 2 so far, a 3rd one down in North Bend on June 16th. Originally, our schedule was going to have us with a roadmap due by September of this year. We've got a bill in the legislature to give us some more time in recognition that this engagement just takes time to do right, and we don't want to repeat any mistakes about having to rush the process. So, in the roadmap itself, some of the key areas that we're focusing on is this alternative futures idea. It was one of our first exercises to ask people in our group to move themselves 30 years in the future and imagine in that future one scenario where they have offshore wind and we don't regret it, one where we don't have offshore wind and we don't regret it, and what are the key characteristics of each, and then look back over that 30-year span and identify the waypoints that got us to each of those futures. And we're trying to turn that into a pictorial representation of what Oregon's path could be. We're also doing that policy assessment, looking for where we have gaps that can then lead to recommendations. And then, as I mentioned, these strategic planning elements where we have some potential specific actions that we might take as a state. Next, please. So here's the peek behind the curtain. As I mentioned, we are working on a waypoint diagram that is identifying what we think needs to happen when. And I think some of the key dilemmas there relate to the information that needs to be known before a lease versus after a lease. I think that's one of the main areas of tension where in Oregon, many people have asked for a programmatic environmental impact statement, looking for cumulative assessments for the entire California current to look at kind of what's the carrying capacity, if you will, of that system for potential offshore wind. And also just that research agenda question of what are questions that we need to know the answer to before committing to leases, because there is a concern that if you invest a lot of resources in that lease, it's hard to say no when you get to the permit stage a few years later. We are looking for those policy gaps and we are identifying some, and we're letting that mature. This question about whether the state should lead our own marine spatial planning effort is one where we don't quite have consensus. There are a lot of considerations on either side of that question, but there is a potential for us to, as Jessica mentioned, maybe have the opportunity to turn over some of the stones that weren't turned over during the BOEM process, such as a multi-layer assessment for the entire south span. We're talking about how we manage uncertainty and risk. And one of the big questions there relates to adaptive management plans. Who's actually done one that works? And what kind of specificity it is in those plans? How do you account for the need to have maneuverability if down the road you learn something that you didn't expect? And that relates to the question of accountability. How can we build enforceable agreements into our process, given the limitations of our authority, so that we can make sure we keep a presence after the issue? This question of a research agenda, the Ocean Policy Advisory Council's Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee is working on that off to the side, and we're hoping to see what they emerge with later this summer and to adopt that as part of our roadmap And alongside that, taking a note from the East Coast, which did the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative, I believe. And then state of California, who is also working to develop their own multi-party science collaborative. We are asking ourselves, should Oregon have something like that as well, trying to make a big table where we can be looking at the science with multiple interested parties, trying to build some consensus there before we need it. As I mentioned, we're in that community benefit conversation, trying to figure out what the right structure is and what the role of the state ought to be. We're talking about what the market signal to the development community should be, because the reality is that 4 of the 5 bidders dropped out last year when we had this open leasing. And that was one of the key reasons why leasing was postponed. So clearly, the development community is also seeing risk and needing to see certain signals from the state. But what does that look like? And then finally, this question of exit ramps, which is a term that get a lot of consternation around this term. And it was somewhat of an inherited term. And we've talked about, well, are you just pulling off to the rest area and back on the highway? Are you just going off and never coming back? We're still exploring that. In June, I think we'll get into that a little bit. Next, please. So I want to shift now a little bit and talk about federal consistency. For those who are not aware, it does give the state the ability to apply our state policies to a federal permit or a federal action. And Oregon is a little bit unique because we have this thing called a GLD, a geographic location description, where essentially we got pre-approval from the NOAA Office for Coastal Management to conduct federal consistency reviews for marine energy projects out to 500 fathoms. And when we do those reviews, we get to bring our whole satchel of policies with us. So those policies that Andy was talking about for the territorial sea plan, they don't stop at 3 miles. We actually get to apply those to a federal project. And that includes some fisheries protection policies that are included in Part 5. So very important. So when we have a federal consistency review, we get 2 bites of the apple. One at leasing and one at the construction operations plan. We can either concur, so we say, yep, consistent. We can concur with conditions, which is a yes if decision. And that those conditions have to be negotiated. Or we object. And if we object, the federal agency is not permitted to issue the permit to the applicant unless there is a successful appeal to the US Secretary of Commerce. So it gives the state a pretty loud voice in the process. And then also I do want to mention that there are state and local permits that would apply inside that 3 nautical mile and up on land that we use as evidence of consistency. So there are multiple players. Next, please. As I mentioned, we get 2 bites of the apple. So those 2 yellow arrows. The first one we did last year when Bowen proposed leasing, and we emerged with a conditional concurrence that had 19 conditions on it that included some environmental protective measures, such as stay 1,000 feet away from rock when you're down at the bottom and you're conducting your characterization efforts, because that's a policy in Part 5 that we know we're going to be able to apply down the road. So when you think about those future constraints, and rocky habitats specifically. The second bite of the apple comes about 5 years later, after a lessee has done their studies, designed their application, and have something to actually propose to build. At that time, we get to collect all the information that we think is necessary to decide whether that project is consistent with our various policies. And again, we have those 3 basic options. But we don't get to have a long tail on the process. Once we issue concurrence at the permit stage, state's done. And we don't get to take it back later. So that again comes to this question of adaptive management and accountability. Next, please. The coastal effects that we're able to review cover a broad range, including indirect and cumulative effects. I won't dwell on this, but just to know, we look at a lot of stuff. Next, please. And when we conduct a review, we are expecting that those key review considerations would be including our fish and wildlife policies, including our wildlife policy. We have a food fish policy as well that promotes the optimum management of fish for human use. Fisheries effects would be a key consideration. Viewshed impacts, anything that intersects with our local communities would have to comply with those policies. As Andy mentioned, we have parts 4 and 5 of the territorial sea plan that would cover any undersea cables and the facilities themselves. And then as part of our reviews, we have a coordination and consultation opportunity and responsibility with tribes as part of our decision. Please. Just, we have a longer list than, we have like 3,000 enforcement policies, but the main ones are here highlighted in red that I mentioned just a moment ago. And we can move forward. If it goes, thank you. So I'm going to shift, this is my last shift. Here are some things I'm bringing this afternoon when I talk to the Oregon Trawl Commission. The first thing, just recognizing all the effects that we've been hearing about, either through our process or the comments that have been made to BOEM. And you've heard a lot of them here today, but just what I'm hearing too, and I'm wondering if I'm missing it, that we have heard about concerns about when you're extracting energy from the California current, what are those secondary and tertiary effects of that direct exclusion? But then there's this question or this concept I heard about just a couple of weeks ago, and I believe Mike, maybe you were in that meeting as well, where someone was talking about we get hit twice. Because if there's fish attraction into an array and we can't go in there, well, now the areas that are available to us have less fish. And so there's that concern that we just don't know yet. Jessica mentioned the squeeze when vessels go into areas that are not excluded. You've heard about safety radar interference, effects on stock assessment tracks, gear loss we heard about as well, or vessel damage, competition for space in ports when you have these big vessels coming in, when you have wet storage for device or for foundations that are being put together, how does that affect? And then all of this has secondary effects to communities and other economies that rely on fishing, such as processing support. We also just heard the criticism that the BOEM spatial planning didn't account for or properly weigh all the areas of importance, and that's something we want to pay attention to. And then, as you know, it all adds up to a big picture about loss of livelihoods and having a generational effect. So out of that, what can we do? Right now, as a state, we think that we have a few basic tools. Through our federal consistency authority, we do have some fisheries protection standards that we would apply to an action. And that includes an encouragement for applicants to seek agreements with fishing communities. We have an example from the OSU project where there was an agreement between the crabbing community and OSU for how conflicts would be managed there, which is, I think, a great model. We could potentially include conditions on our concurrence that would be meant to avoid or minimize harm. Some ideas I've heard about so far would be transit corridors, or if we can find some way to set the maximum size, or even from a conversation I had just last week, if the state could just explicitly set a cap and say, we're going to start, and we heard the idea of a pilot project yesterday. If we just said, we're going to start at 1 gigawatt, but we're going to start at no more than 3, and we're going to watch it for a while and see what the effects actually are. Is that a policy the state could have that would address some of these concerns? This idea, again, of if we had state-led spatial planning, might we find different areas than were identified before? And then finally, we do have the opportunity to require, kind of indirectly through federal consistency, compensation agreements with fisheries. We've seen that on the East Coast, but we also have heard loud and clear from the communities here, they're not interested in being bought out of livelihoods and traditions and food. So we don't consider that to be a leading tool. Go ahead. So the questions that I'm bringing to these fishing communities, and maybe they're similar to questions you all are asking, is, and we're hearing it all over the place, what can coexistence look like? Is it possible? And maybe it's not possible within the postage stamp of an array, but if we think broader, are there opportunities, and what are those means? I think there's an open question about the state's role in a grievance process, if there are friction or conflicts down the road, and what that should look like. I want to understand better what losses can be compensated for, when is that tool appropriate versus when it's not. And then from, we have some ideas for mitigation that we might be able to require, but are there others that are out there that ought to be thought of? Trying to see if fishing communities would be interested in participating in a new spatial planning process again, and what they would hope to gain from it. And then finally, just a broad open question. What can we do as a state over the next 5 to 10 years to better clarify the path and to make it a better process? I believe that's what I have. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and a very interesting talk on the proactive efforts that you're making as the state. So we're late on time, but we have a little bit per question. We're running into our lunch hour with the next speakers. So I open the floor for questions. Jeremy?
First, a really great presentation. Yeah, really good on a lot of, I think, issues that we need to think about. You're really sort of thinking about the future. That's sort of what we're doing. And in that regard, and this goes to all three panelists, I said, what are your recommendations on how to improve the BOEM process? So, where do you see the biggest pitfalls, and help us think these things through, because you're actually working on the ground, and I think it would be helpful to us.
I suppose I could offer that, some of the things have already been recommended to BOEM related to doing your programmatic environmental impact statement upfront. And I know in California, they issued the 5 theses. Now they're doing a programmatic on those 5 theses. So they've got it kind of topsy-turvy. And I recognize that until you know what you're actually building, you're gonna be limited. But they now have also a program design envelope that they put out. And so there is some work that could be done. I do want to commend that BOEM has put money on the table over the years to be doing some baseline studies, but that really that kind of work and investment needs to continue. And I think absent federal investment for support of that broader spatial planning, cumulative assessment, and working with states specifically to help us elucidate what our specific research gaps are, that there could be more collaboration in that process so that what BOEM is looking for meets what the state's gonna need eventually.
Very good.
And then,
Yes, thank you very much. My question is for Jeff with the offshore wind road mapping. Are you including what the alternative energy generation would be without that 30-year? I really appreciated how you said, imagining in 30 years, if we're not gonna have any regrets, whether we have offshore wind installed or not. Are you including what the alternative energy generation to meet those increased energy demands for the state would be?
that's a great question, and it's one that we talk about in our roundtable, and it gets kind of to what our charge is. We are charged to make an offshore wind road, not a state energy strategy. But Oregon Department of Energy is making a state energy strategy right now, and they owe that to the legislature in November. So if we don't go the offshore wind route, then I believe it would be kind of in their shop to be talking about what those alternative ways would be.
Okay, thank you.
Third question.
Right, hey, for both Andy and Jeff, thanks to all the presenters, so this is great, exactly what we needed to hear, so thank you. as you were going through, particularly Annie and Jeff, you were talking about the factors that you consider in terms of the total coastal zone issues. One of the things that we're thinking about a little bit, and I wonder if you can explain your process, is how you're evaluating trade-offs. And it's said another way, do you have weighting for those things? Or is it current users get, tragedy accountants claim because they were there first, it's a taking if we change that balance. How do you weigh the goods and offsets? And what would you recommend we think about in that same vein, other than straight up cost benefit analysis?
Andy, I don't know if you want to jump in. I guess I just lean on the mitigation hierarchy as the starting point. Start with avoidance and minimization.
On down. Our state
Don't play off one another. So there's that too. But Andy, you want to jump in?
Yeah, Jeff, I think that perspective is correct. We are trying to support the maximum compatible uses of ocean space that we can. And in the instance of marine hydrokinetic energy, a device that would sit on the bottom of the ocean and create energy through pressure of waves rolling over the top of it, would have a very different impact on our mobile fisheries that are mainly up in the water column. So you would have the opportunity to have more uses, but there were many companies with many different designs, and so as we were factoring in, what are the trade-offs and how do we look at that? We, I think, really fell back onto what our knowns were in terms of the resources that are there, the economic impact that those resources are already providing to the state, and what's the risk of losing that if you are considering a new use that could displace kind of those values, right? So I think that's, the state did not want to say no, right? We developed a plan that had graded standards and sensitivities for the purpose of allowing that kind of experimentation and that kind of work to proceed, while also recognizing that that long-term precautionary approach to the state resources has served us well over time.
Can I pick at that just a little bit, the press? I mean, I think my experience, I think, matches yours, which is that for the most part, consultation and mitigation measures you can maneuver around multiple users' concerns almost all the time. But just to push this to its logical limit, where you get into a straight trade-off, you can do this, like you said, I think Andy, you said, start out, if you put a permanent structure there, it's there. Yeah. And we're not bottom trawling over that anymore, right? So where you do have a straight up trade-off, how are you weighting whether those are trade-offs worth making? And I think what I heard you say is start small, experiment, know for sure, and then think about trade-offs. Is that a fair capture?
Yeah, that is actually in part 5 of the Territorial Sea Plan. We have a preferential approach for phased development and adaptive management. So instead of going from 0 to 100 devices out there, we want to see a company go from 0 to 5, take a look and see how those 5 are performing, and then continue on if they're not having the effects to the other resources and uses, right? So that is in our existing state policy now. And I think it is protective of those resources and uses that are there. And again, that has served us well over time.
If I could yes and that, thinking more about if coexistence inside an array is not possible, so there's coexistence at the micro and macro, that you may not be able to make that trade-off decision, or there may be an unavoidable trade-off at a localized scale. But if you can expand your circle of awareness and considering it, there may be other options. We just haven't had those conversations.
Gotcha. Thank you so much.
Kind of a question, Jeff, and maybe for all three, Jessica as well. You know, we're left with the sense, I certainly am, that the states are in much better position to engage with the local stakeholders, the tribes, the fisheries, than say BOEM, because you're engaging with them all the time and you're doing the outreach well in advance of any effort by BOEM. Is there a better way that the state and BOEM can partner together? You mentioned funding is one, you know, perhaps the federal government continuing to support data development but what would you see as the ideal partnership?
Well, if I can respond to that, I was the staff person who was frontline when BOEM first came to the state and asked whether or not we wanted to take a planning approach or whether or not the state just wanted to have BOEM move forward with their own development of call areas. And I brought this issue to the Ocean Policy Advisory Council in 2019. And the Ocean Policy Advisory Council, after hearing kind of the differences of the approach, recommended that the state take a planning approach. And what that meant was that we worked together with BOEM over the course of year and a half to develop a data gathering and engagement plan where we held over 60 meetings. And of course, this was the year of the pandemic, so they were all virtual meetings. And we asked people what their priorities were from a resource and data gathering perspective, as well as, kind of to introduce the idea of, the offshore wind leasing process. We concluded the development of that plan. We developed the Aura Wind Map tool together via a partnership with the West Coast Ocean Data Portal that the state and BOEM could both contribute resource information to that would be, kind of a behind the curtain view of what's the information that's available for consideration. And that tool, I think, did serve not only the state well in its engagement, but it served BOEM well. I think we were impacted by lack of attention on the issue. There wasn't an immediate kind of lease process that was moving forward at that time. And people had their attentions divided because of just surviving daily life in the world of COVID. So we tried hard. We spent multiple years, a lot of meetings where we were doing outreach prior to the initiation of any call areas. And the approach that the state took with BOEM in that call area process was to give general guidance. And at that time, the governor did not want to have explicit guidance and kind of direction to BOEM. And so what came out was kind of a public comment letter that's, gave them a short kind of list of criteria, one of which was that we wanted BOEM to maximize the use of ocean space for any potential future leasing. And that meant that the southern half of Oregon was really the place that BOEM concentrated their views, because that's where the wind resource was also the best, right? So if you have a lease in an area that has a better wind resource, you are maximizing the use of ocean space because of, you're using less space to gain more energy. We also gave them criteria like we want no consideration of devices within 12 miles ashore. And that was a general proxy for concentration of resources and uses that exist on the top of the shelf, and would really minimize the ecological impacts to our seabirds, that offshore island seabirds that are colony nesting birds, our marine mammals that are often concentrated closer to shore, where you have I would call them more concentrated zones of upwelling and biological productivity, right? So at that time, we gave them a short list of criteria from which they would develop the call areas. And, as we moved further into that leasing process, the state continued to provide what I would say is general criteria, again, not wanting to have ownership of that process, realizing that it wasn't the state of Oregon decision. And so we could be put at risk if the governor were to, for example, say, I want these sites in these areas, and BOEM disagreed, right? Because they, as the federal agency, have the ultimate authority for leasing. So part of the challenge was just the dynamic of the federal agency having the authority and, having their own rules on how they need to go through the leasing process. But the state did engage, spent multiple years engaging, and continued to support outreach and education about the process all throughout. I would say that the task force model wasn't a great model for engagement. We didn't have, I think, consistent care and feeding of the task force over time, so it was hard to keep the right kind of local county commissioners who would want to be participating on the board. The meetings were often solely focused only on the needs that BOEM had in the moment, and so there was limited ability to control the dialogue. There was also very limited public comment and engagement opportunities because of FACA rules, and those really, I think, did not sit well with stakeholders who wanted to be able to provide comment directly to the task force. So I think those were some of the issues I saw as a staff person in the early periods of the state working with BOEM. But we did have, and I would commend BOEM's staff on their early work with us in developing the data gathering engagement plan and on the many different outreach events, public meetings that we really tried to make BOEM show up in the state so that people could ask questions and understand what their process was.
All right, well, thank you very much. I think we could go on for a while, but we do have our next speaker that we've got to move on to. Hopefully you'll be available for a few questions as we go forward, but thanks to all three of the presenters. Great job. Okay, Michelle. Well, I'll go ahead. Yeah, just our next speaker is Larry Phillips from the Pacific Fisheries Policy. He is the Pacific Fisheries Policy Director at American Sports Fishing Association. So Larry?
Yeah, welcome, Larry. I'll just by way of introduction, I've known Larry for a lot of years. We've worked together at the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. He's engaged with the Pacific Fishery Management Council process for several years and is now the Pacific Fisheries Policy Director for the American Sport Fishing Association. So welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Michelle. Yeah, appreciate that opportunity to share a few words. So again, I'm Larry Phillips, the Pacific Fisheries Policy Director for what's called the American Sport Fishing Association. We're the nation's fishing trade organization. We provide a unified voice for recreational fishing community. ASA members include businesses, organizations for every sector of the sport fishing industry, including manufacturers, retailers, resource management agencies, charter fishing operations, conservation nonprofits, media, and others. So again, I appreciate the opportunity. Just by way of acknowledgement, we realize, the recreational industry realizes that renewable energy will be part of the nation's profile moving forward, and we look forward to an opportunity to be engaged in that. I haven't been participating in the last couple of days, so I'm sure others have voiced. I use the word frustration, but we understand it's a complicated process, and there's many stakeholders and pieces of this, but largely we feel we've been somewhat
ignored in this conversation. So we look forward to this conversation and many more to come to voice our concerns relative to the recreational fishing industry. Just so again, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I want to share some thoughts relative to our concerns. Just for background, in 2016, we had about 5.2 million saltwater recreational angler trips off the West Coast. That's Washington, Oregon, and California. The economic contribution of those fisheries, of all recreational fishery, so including inland fisheries, but just for perspective, it's about $12 billion annually. And just by way of that, there really is no sector that has a potential to be more impacted through the development of offshore wind energy than recreational anglers. And that really is the premise of our concerns and our desire to be included in the conversation as we move forward. So some of the areas that we feel are really need to be addressed, and I'm guessing some of these have been been covered already, but really it's displacement is a big one. We have really no understanding right now, very little understanding. Michelle Conrad and others have been involved in marine spatial planning, but really understanding exactly where recreational fishing is occurring is something that is really a missing part of the data and gap here moving forward. And then there's just this concern about potential, although we don't know whether areas will be specifically closed to fishing. Obviously, there are lots of determinations, and once we see the construction operation plan, we'll know more. We'll have to have conversations with the U.S. Coast Guard about safety issues, but there will be functional closures certainly associated with offshore wind energy development. Safety risks and navigation concerns, floating turbines, anchoring systems, entanglement with fishing gear, potentially damaging fishing equipment and endangering vessels, wind turbines potentially interfering with navigation, increasing collision risks and adverse. But again, we'll know more when we see some construction operation plans. Another really big one for us, our concern for us, is environmental impacts and on fish stocks and habitats. Construction noise, magnetic fields, altered ocean currents could change fish distribution, abundances, and species composition. As I mentioned early on, a real challenge for us is we feel that there's been significant inadequate stakeholder engagement. Recreational fishing groups feel concerned and overlooked in the rush to meet federal and state clean energy goals, specifically in places like California. Limited engagement by BOEM with fishing communities, it just candidly fosters distrust and perceptions of unfairness. Again, I already mentioned the economic impact of fishing. Reduced access to fishing grounds may increase transit times, potentially requiring navigation around areas. This can increase fuel costs, lowering income for charter operators and recreational businesses. Overlap with wind lease areas with productive fishing grounds threaten coastal economies that are reliant on these fishing revenues. I'm sure you've discussed it, but one of the big concerns we have also is the just displacing of NOAA's long-term data sets, these stock assessments, fishery independent assessments that provide the council with critical information regarding fisheries abundances that we've invested so much time and energy, money into, that in the absence of those assessments will provide a significant amount of uncertainty, potentially exposing the agencies to litigation, and really not maximizing the economic well-being of the nation's fisheries under Manx and Stevens. The potential to
Oh, you froze up, Larry.
Internet, very unflattering.
Guys, I got you back. For a moment.
Never freeze up.
Yeah.
Are we okay still?
We are.
All right. All righty. Yeah, just the potential to coexist with mitigation. We look forward to having these conversations. BOEM's January 2025 guidance promotes early engagement and mitigation, compensation, but recreational anglers doubt the effectiveness without stronger inclusion. Collaborative research, data sharing could improve site selection and reduce impacts, but trust and enforcement remain critical. So I want to leave us with some questions. We have really just a few things that I want to hopefully can resonate with folks. But again, we don't know how many anglers are even fishing in and around the offshore wind energy development areas. And then the question is, how can we mitigate for impacts if we have no idea how much effort will be impacted? What is the economic loss? How will displacement impact efforts in other areas? And how will offshore wind energy development impact NOAA's ability to conduct stock assessments? But again, I want to reiterate, we acknowledge that we're the reaction from some of the folks in the fishing community have been a hell no, strong hell no. But it would be, we also understand that there are many of the nation's scientists look at changing ocean conditions associated with a changing environment as contributing to things like significant salmon declines and stock distribution changes. So we acknowledge that renewable energy will be part of the platform, but we respectfully request an opportunity to be more meaningfully engaged as we navigate through these difficult conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry, and very much. We'll open the floor for questions now, and Michael Conroy, followed by Dave Shepherd.
Hey Larry, thanks for being here and thanks for what you've done and what you continue to do for your stakeholders. Very much appreciate it. I have 3 questions. One is going to be totally unfair and I apologize in advance. The first one is, we heard from Jessica today about the lack of recreational data and you sort of bolstered that in your comments. But with referring to the recreational outboard fishery off Oregon, the fact that, the charter fishing vessels could be used as a proxy for recreational fishing effort, is that a fair comparison given the different vessel sizes and the different operational capacities of those vessels?
I mean, I think that there is some lessons to be learned there and some data that can be taken from that would help better understand. I mean, fishermen by nature are going to navigate to the areas where there are fish. And so those areas are, I think that's a fair assessment, but I also know that, given the just the fishing fleet in general, faster boats, smaller boats are moving into areas that are targeting. We know that one of the most increasing fishery is our albacore fishery off the coast. That's often results in small, quick boats venturing offshore to upwards of 60, 70 miles. I know the boat behind me has been out that far. So while it does lend provide us with a tool to better understand, where hook and line fishers are finding success and occupying the space in the marine environment, it is not the same. We have upwards of, you saw 5 million angler trips in 2000. I think that was 2016, according to NOAA's economic benefit of fisheries to the nation. But we have limited entry charter operators on the Washington coast. So, the number of folks that are out there is a tiny fraction relative to the recreational angler trips. So again, how many, it might give us a generalization of where folks are fishing, but it's not going to give us the effort counts of potentially the number of anglers that are going to be potentially displaced.
No, perfect. I appreciate that answer. I'm going to skip my not controversial question and go to the one that you did. Sorry, I'm just going to apologize in advance for. One of the commercial guys about who joined us yesterday was, if you've heard of any chatter of insurance coverage being excluded if operating within a wind farm. It's been a big concern that expressed with given the impacts on radars, as you noted, the increased possibility of collision, that there's a fear that insurance companies will exclude operating within an array or operating within near an array from coverage. Have you heard anything about that on the rec side?
I have not heard anything on the rec side, and I haven't, ASA has been involved in the uh, development on the East Coast, and I have not heard, obviously not the same, but I have not heard those concerns. We have some folks that are in the insurance industry, and I'll be sure to bring that up when I see those folks. I just think there's so much uncertainty on what this will look like, what the footprint will look like, particularly, maybe under AB 525 in California, with the number of turbines that are potentially there. So again, until we see the construction operation plans and get a better understanding of what those look like, and we'll certainly be digging into those types of questions. But thanks for that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Larry, appreciate it.
Good other question. Oh, Dave, you're next time.
Thanks very much, Larry. It was good. Two things. One is, and I guess it's a comment really, but, and it was mentioned by Jeff as well, I think, but the structures that might be put offshore might act as FADs, fishery attractive devices, basically. And at the same time, they're excluding observations for fishery independent assessments. And so she said it's a double whammy, I think. And I hadn't thought of that before, but it's interesting, and we should take note of that. The question is, you asked how to be more meaningfully engaged in the process, in essence. And yesterday we heard from Ken Bates in California, and he talked about the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association. And I guess my question to you is, do you advocate for combining the forces of recreational fishers to speak with one voice, so to speak? No pun intended. To be at the table. I think you see what I mean there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think the initial reaction is that many of the issues, environmental resource issues, access are, they don't have a single advocate. We all are going to be advocating to make sure that we're doing this right. I think we'll have unique challenges. Obviously, when we think about things like mitigation, what does that look like? I mean, it's easier to mitigate the impact of a commercial fishery when we know that this is the landing associated with that real estate in the past, and if it's not there, it's easier. But when we displace a recreational angler, what does that mean? Are we going to other areas? Are we fishing on species with unique fidelity that don't occur in other areas? So the total potential catch is less. So there's just lots of pieces of this to think about. I think I think uniting all of our voices together is critical, in terms of ensuring that we're thinking about all the details of each of these different projects as we move forward, and then what impact they'll have on the resource and our industries. I think there's a lot of opportunity for alignment, I guess is what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Next question, Brian.
Great. Hey, thanks so much for talking with us today. Really super helpful. I'm going to kind of just hit something that's a little bit tangential to the direct topic here, but maybe useful for comparison purposes. The Coast Guard did its port access route study stuff. I think that's coming up on about a year ago that they put out their final note. They haven't enacted the recommendations that they published yet. But I wanted to ask, what was your impression of that process? And specifically, is there any contrast? Like, if it went better, why do you think it went better? If it went the same or worse, sort of how do the two processes compare? In addition to what is your reaction to its recommendations?
Yeah, I'm going to have to apologize. I'm not familiar with that.
The port access routes, great. Okay, well, that tells me pretty much what I need to know right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about access in general, I mean, obviously there's going to be a significant role that the Coast Guard plays in determining safety and navigation and all the pieces of that. But until we see what this footprint looks like, until we know what's happening, we're going to just have to continue to try to engage where we can and make sure. Our hope is that access will not be limited. Our hope is we'll have access right up to and around the infrastructure. But it is the Pacific Ocean, and environmental conditions change quickly, and there will be hazards, and I don't know exactly what those look like, but and if we are excluded from areas, we'll want to have conversations about how we mitigate those impacts to our industry.
Great. Perfect.
Larry, do you have any ideas on how this data gap on where recreational fishing occurs can be filled? Would it be industry-wide surveys? Would it, what is the mechanism?
Well, I mean, I suspect there's technologies exist out there, from whether it's satellite imagery to look at who's fishing where, when. But I would hope that NOAA Fisheries and BOEM would work together to fill in those data gaps. I think that there's likely technology that exists with vessel monitoring that occurs already with some of the industry, and most private vessels don't have that. But there might be, we've got lots of technology now with inReach GPSs, and there's a variety of different tools I think that might exist in the industry, working with some of the folks at Garmin and the other companies that might be able to lend us some tools to better understand where those concentrations of fishers are occurring offshore. But it really is the critical piece of in my opinion, of the data that's missing on when we know what they catch. We've got significant resources that have invested into portside sampling, but what we don't know is where they go. We don't, particularly the recreational fishers, and offshore in California, we know that there's a lot of private boats out, lots of places to access. So that from our lens is one of the pieces of information that we really need to move forward with a conversation that's helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, Dave?
What about RecFin?
As far as where folks are fishing?
Well, as a source of information for recreational fisheries, there's experts all around me that know more about it than I do, but you also, is it not a source that would be useful?
I mean, there's probably other experts in here in the room that know more about it than I do, but RecFin is I mean, we do a really good job of quantifying catch, and that's really the objective of RecFin. It doesn't say, it's a general area. Marine will ask folks where they fished, and it's usually we fished in Marine Area 1 or Marine Area 2, which extends from 3 miles, from the shoreline out to Hawaii. So.
Yes, good. Yeah.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, just to add to that, to Larry's point, it's the spatial resolution of that data. So we do have spatial information that's large scale, but when you're talking about putting in place, it doesn't align. So we do have the information of how many trips from which ports and rough areas. But when you start overlaying that on the spatial scale in which these areas are being cited, that's where the difference is, and it's not really useful information at that point that we can determine anything besides general statements.
Jump in real quick also to answer this.
Sure.
Yeah, so in California, they can't access, DFW can't access private harbors and marinas. Most of the seaworthy vessels are based in private marinas and harbors. They can access a launch ramp, and they can ask, no offense to people who use launch ramps, their vessels typically are smaller, and they're not gonna be traveling to the location where offshore wind is potentially gonna be located. So that in California, I don't know if the same is
It's not
true.
the same, yeah, so it's different in Oregon, so it's state specific as well, access to.
Yeah, so in California, it's even a bigger problem because the vessels that are typically fishing in those areas, CDFW can't access those vessels to get that information.
Okay, let's see. We have time for 2 more questions, Jeremy, and then we'll finish with Michelle.
Thanks. So, on the East Coast, the rec fishermen are generally neutral to support it. Both because the commercial guys are excluded They also think there may be artificial reef effects. And then the charter boat captains have also seen that they have some tourism business that they can take people out to see, particularly in the shoulder months where the seas are a little rough, people are not fishing, but they're not so rough. It sounds like, and it may be that BOEM is just transplanting what's going on the East Coast to the West Coast, from the fixed structures to the floating structures. And so the question is, how do we better get you talking, or BOEM talking to you, to explain some of the differences between recreational fishing around floating structures and some of the constraints, and recreational fishing around fixed structures? I don't know if you have any.
Yeah,
thoughts on that.
I think, I mean, obviously very different. We're near shore on many of the East Coast. And I agree with you that largely we haven't heard negative. I mean, we obviously did early on, but we haven't, it's resulted in fish attraction in many instances. So these stationary connected to the bottom structures have resulted in target areas for recreational anglers. But there's just there's so much uncertainty. I don't know if there's any areas where we can point to where we have these large offshore wind infrastructure that have, either resulted in better, or we just don't know at this point. I mean, the West Coast is very different in terms of the species assemblages that occur here. When I think about what of our highly migratory species is really what we're talking about, because of the location of many of these way offshore. It's right now it's uncertain as to what environmental impact those will have in terms of fish attraction and angler satisfaction, or benefit or negative impact. We just don't know.
Michelle?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Larry. And just I guess to put a finer point on some of the questions and how to best get engagement from the recreational fishing community, and even just at the state level, if not at the BOEM level. So just kind of an example, is ASA, or are some of your members going to be participating in the Oregon offshore wind roadmap process? So is there engagement that is happening at the state levels, or engagement with the BOEM task force by recreational anglers?
Yeah, it's a good question, Michelle. I mean, and the challenges with, the recreational fishing industry and community at times is its own worst enemy. So, we've got to find ways to collaborate on unified voice or unified messaging. But we've largely felt that our engagement up until this point has been because we have forced ourselves into the conversation. It's not that we've been invited in. And I mean, I mentioned earlier that the economic impact of recreational fishing and the 5 million angler trips a year offshore, from our perspective, would lend itself to the process developing some sort of engagement with our industry because of the potential for displacement. So yeah, we'll track the process, and there's various state engagement points and connection points and federal opportunities. But again, we're hopeful that the process will reach out to us and say, hey, here's what's going on, and it is coming, and it's going fast. And I think that's the biggest concern a lot of folks have. It's just, this is going so quickly that we don't know on the West Coast what this is going to look like in 5 years and 10 years. And that uncertainty is concerning, that it is moving so fast. But yeah, I mean, I'm happy to be as helpful as I can with, we have our members, and we certainly don't claim that we represent everyone. But I think that the 7 out of 10 issues that are important to us are something that we would all agree on. And that is access and impact on the resource, the potential for mitigation down the road? What does that look like? I mean, we just don't know.
Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Jeff.
Can I just say, hi Larry, I'm Jeff. I'm doing an Oregon roadmap for offshore wind. I'd love to talk to you and invite you in. So let's.
I appreciate that, Jeff. Thank you. And I'm happy to have that conversation. Let's circle back after this.
Great, thank you.
Right, thank you, Larry. Thank you to our three panelists from Oregon. It was very educational for all of us. So that was a good gift.
For those online, we're taking a lunch break and we'll be back at 1 p.m. Pacific time.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We will start this afternoon session hearing from Mary Kroll and Claire Richard, Riker. I'm not sure, you can correct me. They're both with the American Clean Power Organization, which represents the offshore wind development companies. Please go ahead.
There we go. Now I'm on video. It's a little hard to hear you all in the room. I don't know if that's just me. Claire, I can turn my volume way up.
Yeah,
It's softer, but if I turn it up, I can hear okay.
Okay. Looks like I have the ability to share a screen, so should I just begin here?
Yes, please go ahead.
All right, well, thank you everybody for having us. This is Molly Kroll with American Clean Power. I'm the Pacific Offshore Wind Director. Work very closely with the 5 companies developing projects who have leases off the coast of California. And I'll let my colleague Claire Shea introduce herself as well. We're going to be speaking broadly from the industry perspective. If you don't know, ACP is a multi-tech trade association working across clean energy technologies. Claire and I both focus on offshore wind and have experience with the development process, which we hope to share with you today. So I'll hand it over to Claire to introduce herself and kick us off.
Great, thanks so much, Molly. And great to meet you all. My name is Claire Shea. I'm based in our Washington, D.C. office, which is our headquarters here. And have been working on offshore wind for about 5 years now. Behind me is, if you can see, is a vessel that is pulling out turbine components out of the Port of New Bedford out to the Vineyard Wind 1 project. And I socialize a lot in maritime policy. And work a lot with the United States Coast Guard and other kind of maritime issues, including the Jones Act and other things. I work on a lot of supply chain issues, and I also work on tax policy, which is a big topic in DC right now with the budget reconciliation process. So if you have questions on that, I am more than happy to answer. So I think we're going to just talk a little bit about offshore wind in general, and then kind of dive into a couple of key subject matter specifics on fisheries and on Coast Guard issues. So first, just wanted to give a top line level of why offshore wind, right? So I think it's helpful to look at offshore wind is relatively new in the United States, but it is not a new technology globally. Right, there are over 37,000 megawatts of offshore wind in China and about the same in Europe if you combine both the EU and the UK. This chart that you see here is from 2023. We had 42 megawatts or 7 turbines in 2023, and we have gone up to about 172 megawatts in the past year with the oncoming of South Fork and off the coast of New York onto the scene. And so we're definitely trying to catch up, and the last administration made some large moves towards kind of pushing the offshore wind industry. And we've seen some slowdowns with this administration, but hope to kind of continue to move the industry forward. So if we go to the next slide, why, again, taking like a step kind of closer into the United States, why do we need offshore wind? We need offshore wind because we need all sources of energy in the United States at the moment. a wide coalition of folks, including the American Petroleum Institute, the US Chamber of Commerce, the Nuclear Energy Institute, the Alliance to Save Clean Energy, and ourselves came together to basically do this report that shows how electricity demand in the United States is supposed to surge 35 to 50% in the United States between 2024 and 2040. We just need to meet the demand that is to meet the demand that we have in the United States because of data centers, new manufacturing, and electrification trends. We just need an all of the above energy approach. And so that's why we came together to show why all these organizations came together to show that demand. And more than ever, we need projects like offshore wind to help meet that demand in addition to other energy types. Because as folks know, electrical demand is really kind of a regional thing, and different energy types make sense based on where you are. The states have been the first to recognize this. States have really been driving the demand for offshore wind, and they've made that demand via both mandates and goals. And they're through a variety of different mechanisms, either through legislation, executive orders, via the different governors, etc. And the states are the main customer for offshore wind. It gets a little bit more nuanced in terms of what the exact structures are, whether they're PPAs or different offtake agreements, but the states are the main customer, and they've really been driving offshore wind. Offshore wind, however, is mostly in federal waters, and so there's really a unique balance between what the states are buying as the customer and then the permitting process that happens with the federal government. It's truly an exercise in federalism in terms of both states and the federal government being really important pieces of making sure an offshore wind project can happen. So go to the next slide again. So where are we at in the United States? With capacity online, we have 174 megawatts. We've got the Bulk Island Wind Farm off the coast of Rhode Island, which is 30 megawatts, 5 turbines. We've got the Coastal Offshore Wind Project Pilot, which are 2 turbines, about 27 miles offshore Virginia. And then we have the South Fork Wind Farm, which is off the coast of New York that Ørsted just completed at the beginning of 2024. So that's the capacity we have. This is all fixed bottom. We have primarily fixed bottom on the East Coast because the outer continental shelf is shallow, and fixed bottom is just a much more better understood technology globally than floating is so far, just in terms of the amount of megawatts that have been deployed. In terms of projects under construction, we have 5 projects under construction, including Vineyard Wind 1, the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, Revolution Wind and Sunrise Wind by Ørsted, and Empire Wind by Equinor. There's a lot of investment that, it's okay, you can go to the next one. There's a lot of investment that comes with these projects, and we've seen over $25 billion worth of announced supply chain investments, $4 billion in steel production, and $1.8 billion of direct investment in shipbuilding. As you can see by the map, it's not just the East Coast that has been getting these investments, it's also California and the West Coast, but also the Gulf of Mexico, the Gulf of America, and interior states that are supplying these projects. So the supply chain reaches far and wide and continues to grow as projects grow. Next slide. And just to kind of further emphasize that, there's about just under 2,000 supply chain contracts across 40 states in the moment in the United States for offshore wind. And 57% of those investments are in Republican congressional districts. Next slide. We're also seeing a lot of investment in ports. We've seen over $5.2 billion invested in offshore wind projects. There are 25 US ports that are involved in offshore wind or preparing to support the industry. And the picture that you see is the Riggs-Distler Advanced Foundation components for Ørsted's Revolution Wind project. Those are basically the tower internals. So if you can imagine a turbine, right, you have the nacelle and blades that are at the top, and the tower is the stem, right, that holds up the nacelle. And inside the tower, you have tower internals that support the different transformers and other electrical components that go into it. And then also the platform, right, that has the davit crane to allow turbine technicians to land onto the turbine and allow for construction. So there's a lot of laydown area that is needed for offshore wind, and ports are pretty crucial to making sure that as they say, the beast is fed, which are the installation vessels that are quite expensive and quite globally rare And so keeping the beast fed offshore and getting that construction going continuously whenever there's good weather is very important and one of the primary purposes of ports. For floating wind, ports are much different in terms of a lot of the construction happens within the port. So offshore with fixed bottom wind, you have the installation of the monopile and then the rock scour that goes around it, then the tower, the nacelle, and the blades all offshore. However, when it comes to floating wind, a lot of that will be happening in port. So you have the floating foundation and then the tower and the nacelle and the blades that will be built in port, and then it will be tugged out to sea is kind of the general premise. Of course, that is subject to different projects and how there are different mechanisms, but that's the general idea. Next slide. Offshore wind, right? We are a maritime industry. You need a lot of boats, you need a lot of vessels to build offshore wind. There are over 25 different types of vessels that you need to build an offshore wind project. And of those types, you often need multiples of the different types. What this chart is showing you right here are the investments in over 43 different offshore wind vessels that have been made new build for the offshore wind industry so far. These are again for fixed bottom projects. You need a different fleet of vessel for fixed bottom versus floating. And if folks have questions, I can talk about that. You need a lot of vessels both in construction and operations and maintenance. We'll go to the next slide and I'll turn it over to Molly.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, so as Claire mentioned, the why of floating really has to do with the opportunities to build offshore wind. There's limited areas where offshore wind could be installed using fixed bottom technology, given water depth and the shape of the continental shelf, combined with other considerations like ocean uses and environmental protection. So on the West Coast, as you all know, floating is the only technology that will work given both the shape of our continental shelf, but it also allows access to better wind spaces and areas that are lower conflicted. Another reason why for offshore wind in California, just going back to our clean energy goals, California has a 100% carbon-free by 2045 clean electricity goal. We are on track to that, but we need to build 150,000 gigawatts more clean energy capacity to reach that goal. A big majority of that will be sited on land, tons of solar, tons of storage. We'll have space for land-based wind and other technologies. But as we are progressing toward that goal, siting on land will be harder. We'll come up against land use conflicts. And with offshore wind, we have the opportunity to diversify where we're building, as well as diversifying technologies, which helps meet our goals while also balancing other goals of the state, such as our 30 by 30 conservation goals. Again, as you all know, floating offshore wind has some unique attributes from the sort of sea level up, very similar to land-based wind and fixed bottom offshore wind, though maybe different in size. But at sea level and below, some unique attributes. There'll be, of course, floating foundations, large steel mooring lines that hold each turbine in place, inter-array cables, likely dynamic, that will connect to an offshore substation, which may be floating or a semi-submersible, and then a number of electric export cables that'll connect the energy to shore. Oops. So in terms of the specifics of what that, graphic representation will actually translate to when it comes to specific projects, we don't know exactly yet, and that's because our developers don't know precisely yet. I will refer you, though, to BOEM's, well, actually, NREL produced it for BOEM, a representative project design envelope. They prepared this for the programmatic EIS that they completed a draft of in California, put it out in November. And you'll see this is just a cutout of a piece of that, but goes into types of turbine substructures, moorings, anchors, cables, even gets into vessels, export cables, all sorts of things, and provides a pretty wide but illustrative range of what those technology types could look like. I will caution that it is a big range now, given the state of technology, the state of supply chain, and what project developers know about their sites. Only 3 of them have even been out to understand like what the seafloor looks like, which of course determines things like what types of anchors are going to be used. So the range is really wide, but I encourage everybody to look at this, but know that it's a wide range and it will certainly narrow down. So don't just look at the extreme end. It's just for analysis purposes. Now getting into federal leasing and permitting, you all have heard presentations from BOEM, so I'm not going to try to duplicate a lot of that. But just want to sort of impress upon this group that there is a lot of process that will go into project approvals for floating offshore wind off of the West Coast. And make sure everyone understands all of the instances where considerations for fishing and maritime uses will take place. So of course, this all starts, as you probably know, at the identification of lease areas stage. The federal government starts a process with lease area identification, which usually takes a number of years, usually under an intergovernmental task force with the state government and tribal government participation, as well as regular stakeholder opportunities. And the process is really one of winnowing down the large planning area into eventual lease areas. So starting out with a RFI area, moving into the call area phase, then into draft wind energy areas and final wind energy areas. During all of those phases, the BOEM, through the Intergovernmental Task Force, is taking feedback from other government agencies, from stakeholders on potential areas of conflict or concern. Oops, that's not moving forward. There we go. And just this is just like an illustrative example. BOEM has created 2 of how that sort of whittles down into smaller lease areas. We've seen some good evolution of the leasing process through lessons learned that BOEM has learned and applied, including things like preparing draft wind energy areas before just putting out, you know, this is what we think it is. Partnership with NOAA using their NCOS model to get some more refined feedback on potential areas of conflict or consideration. And then they've also started just looking at larger areas to begin with. So there's a broader range of possibilities for where offshore wind could potentially be sited. A couple of examples of this in action. So in California, the history of offshore wind lease areas started in 2016 when Trident Winds proposed an unsolicited lease area off Diablo Canyon and Morro Bay. An RFI followed that by BOEM. Then they initiated the official call for information and nominations in 2018. At that point, they had 3 call areas: Humboldt, Morro Bay, and Diablo Canyon. During the next few years, there was a lot of debate and discussion, especially about the Central Coast areas. The Department of Defense had particular concerns with the Diablo Canyon area. Also heard from fishermen during that time that that area was particularly important. There was a revision. They extended some of the Morro Bay areas, both east and west, eliminated Diablo Canyon, heard additional feedback that the eastern area of the Morro Bay call area, part 2, was also concerning to fishermen. And so the ultimate areas that were leased looked, at least in Morro Bay and the Central Coast, considerably different from where they started. Now today we have 5 lease holders. Those are 5 different companies, 2 off the coast of Humboldt and 3 off the coast of San Luis Obispo County. Also notable for this discussion is the lease process that BOEM initiated enabled companies to choose to apply bidding credits in their bids throughout the lease. These include a total of 170 million in bidding credits. And notable for this group is the lease area use bidding credit, which is almost $30 million, which is to develop programs, compensation, mitigations, specifically to address impacts in the lease area. So not, adjacent to the lease area, but directly in the lease area, with a BOEM sort of specifically designed in partnership with the state to address commercial and tribal fisheries concerns. In Oregon and Washington, similarly, there was and I think everyone here knows the history, some large areas considered early on, and then a couple of areas within two of those broader areas that were put forward toward a potential lease auction, though that auction was later canceled. So from the period of time from the final development of wind energy areas on through the project permitting process, there are a number of opportunities for public engagement. I'm sure BOEM has talked about this, but to be very clear, the winning of a lease is by no means a guarantee that a project will be able to construct or operate. It's really their first right to submit a plan to BOEM and to state authorities for potential approval. So it's really just the beginning. In California, we are at this sort of green phase, teal to green phase of companies beginning site assessments, preparing the information and collecting the information that they'll need to submit both to BOEM and to state agencies. And for the construction and operations plan, which is the major document upon which BOEM will consider both consistency with OXLA and perform NEPA review, there are a number of requirements for the companies to complete in their COP plans. Those include requirements to adhere to best practices for safety, commitment to not causing undue harm or damage to natural resources, proper training, etc. Very prescriptive what the COP plans must demonstrate. They also have to show survey results, propose or include a certification verification agent, very detailed project information, oil spill response plans, safety management systems, and other information and certifications. So moving on to the state permitting side of things. So at the high level, I think this group probably understands well the role of BOEM. BSEE is involved in compliance. California has some unique components of the permitting process given its state agency roles. The biggest ones, just to highlight here, are the Coastal Commission's role. They will perform federal consistency under the Coastal Zone Management Act. They've actually done this once already on BOEM's environmental assessments prior to the lease auction, and then we'll do this again on the BOEM's decision on COP approval. And then they also have a role under the California Coastal Act in providing a coastal development permit. The other big agency is the California State Lands Commission, who will perform CEQA review, that's California Environmental Quality Act, triggered by a developer's application for a state tidelands lease. This is much more detailed depiction, but just to make the point, there are literally dozens and dozens of permits on the federal and state side that an offshore wind project will need to obtain. Everything from California Endangered Species Act incidental take that they may need to stream and lake bed alteration permits, really a number of processes, many agencies involved. Also wanted to highlight for this group, if you haven't seen it, the AB 525 Offshore Wind Strategic Plan. So this was created by statute in a bill passed in 2021, required the state to set offshore wind goals and then also develop a strategic plan to achieve those goals. The state has completed that last summer after nearly 2.5 years of drafting, producing different chapters, a series of stakeholder input opportunities and workshops and specialized outreach to tribes, environmental justice communities, and other groups. There's chapters in this document on everything from workforce development, concerns with or maritime impacts, port development, fishing impacts, etc. So again, I encourage folks to look at this document. It was a good piece of work by California. The CEQA review process, for anyone who is not familiar, CEQA is similar to NEPA, though it has its own flavor. It is similar in that it's asks the state to consider all of the environmental impacts of its discretionary actions. So in this case, the State Lands Commission has been assigned the duties of CEQA review under SB 286 and given their role in approving a state tidelands lease. Similar to NEPA, there is a lot of public process that goes on as part of CEQA, including starting at the scoping period through comments, opportunities on the drafts, through to the final preparation. State Lands Commission also has the duty under state law, AB 52, to consult with the tribes throughout this CEQA review process. The Coastal Commission, the other agency that I've highlighted, has two important roles: the CZMA Act review, which will look at lease area development and export cables in federal waters. Coastal Commission has made it clear that they not only look at impacts in the coastal zone under their authority under CZMA, but effects that happen outside the coastal zone that impact the coastal zone. So taking a broader look than you might think, effect in terms of impacts to things like environmental justice, fisheries, tribes, etc. And then under the CDP, we'll be potentially permitting cable landings and any shoreside infrastructure. So as far as fishing considerations, again, just wanted to draw your attention to some good resources here that the state has developed and has been using together with BOEM in their analysis. These are a couple images from the California Data Basin or Offshore Wind Gateway. You can go on there and apply different layers of fishing activity or population areas for different fish. So these are just up on the left side here, the Humboldt lease area, and the areas where different fish activity overlays most heavily with the lease area, and same for Morro Bay. And the data provided into this database has been, a lot of it, the most valuable data has been contributed directly from fishing organizations. BOEM has also been looking at this in the PIS approach. So this is some images that they've looked at for bottom trawl and pot fishing activity in and around the lease areas, and refer everybody to chapter 3.4.1 of this PEIS. Going back to the lease requirements, wanted to make sure everybody here knows that the leases also require specific engagement with certain parties. So as a lease term, the offshore wind leaseholders have to develop and have developed fisheries communication plans that involves having liaisons that can communicate directly with the fishing industry. They similarly need to prepare Native American tribal communication plans, and are encouraged, of course, to engage actively with mariners and the maritime industry. AB 525, as I talked about before, provides some recommendations to address fisheries impacts, including continuing to use best data and science in consultation with the 7C work group, which I'll talk about in just a minute. Continued support for that work group and developing strategies to avoid impacts to surveys that inform fisheries management. So the 7C Fisheries Work Group, I'm sure this has come up in this group already, but it was established through the Coastal Commission's consistency and concurrence on BOEM's environmental assessment. That was a conditional concurrence, and one of the conditions was 7C, develop an offshore wind fisheries strategic plan. And that was then formalized by SB 286 legislation in 2023. which charged the state with developing a statewide strategy to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to fishing and fisheries, designed to provide guidance to state agencies as they go through their permitting processes, as well as to both the fishing industry and to offshore wind developers. Specifically, the products to be included in this plan include protocols for communication, best practices for site assessment surveys and data collection, a methodology for socioeconomic analysis, a framework for compensatory mitigation, and a fishing agreement template. And I will say, I'm not directly involved in this, but talk to the leaseholder representatives that are working on it and very much understand both the fishing industry and the offshore wind developers have been spending multiple hours every week for the last 18 months on this. So it is a big process, but I think both sides feel that it's very well worth the effort to be talking through some of these difficult issues early on. And then just want to not neglect to say, in considering the impacts for offshore wind, also consider some of the beneficial impacts that could arise. So on the East Coast, have set up some good protocols for comprehensive monitoring. And from these sort of initial images and results from the South Fork Wind Project, this is sort of a higher up toward the surface and then a lower down images of the reef effects on the monopiles, on a monopile from that project. So, well, there are certainly differences in East Coast and West Coast technology. I think some of these learnings in the good monitoring work that's happening on the East Coast will be transferable over here. And then I will pass it back to Claire on the next section.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. So just wanted to talk a little bit about navigational issues and kind of what that plays into it. The Coast Guard is under the Ports and Waterways Safety Act has the authority to ensure safe navigation around an ocean that has multiple uses on it, which is also recognized by Congress in terms of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, right, which allows for leasing and development of oil and gas leases and offshore wind leases and other non-mineral resources. So the Coast Guard is in charge of making sure that there is safe navigation, and they do so through a variety of ways. They do this, one of the primary ways they do this is through their port access route studies, or PARs. There have been multiple PARs across along the East Coast that was consolidated into one kind of larger PARs about 2 years ago, the ACPARs, and there was a PARs on the Pacific coast as well about 2 years ago, looking at different fairways to allow for safe navigation. Now, a fairway is cannot have a permanent structure in it. So a wind turbine is permanently affixed to the seabed. So a fairway basically precludes offshore wind development in it. And so what you see here in this map is that these was the proposed fairways that the Coast Guard was looking at on the Pacific coast. And you can kind of see off the coast of Humboldt, you see the two leases in blue there, and then off the coast of Morro Bay, you see the leases there in blue as well. And so the Coast Guard planned these fairways with that in mind, and we, as ACP, kind of did our job as an advocacy organization, submitted comments kind of explaining, the benefits and why the fairways should go around them, etc. And I'll show in the next slide what the final map looked like. But I also wanted to just quickly note that each offshore wind project produces a navigation safety risk assessment on the risk to mariners and how to minimize and mitigate those risks. So there's definitely kind of the NEPA framework when it comes to navigation of avoid, minimize, and mitigate. So you have kind of avoiding the conflicts by having these kind of fairways and other PARs, looking at that. You had the minimize in terms of the navigational safety risk assessment that the developers have to do as part of their construction operation plan that they submit to that they submit to BOEM, and the mitigation process is also part of that. I'll note that in addition to the avoid, kind of minimize and mitigate kind of piece of this, Coast Guard District 1, which is in New England, and Coast Guard District 5 off the coast of the Mid-Atlantic and Virginia, have done several tabletop safety exercises, including kind of, trying to land a helicopter, a Coast Guard helicopter on the turbines, or at least lower someone down onto the platform in case there is a safety issue and that needs to be done. So they figure out, okay, like the blades, what formation if you're going to install the turbine, what formation does the blades need to be in? They need to be in a bunny-eared formation with the two of them pointing up and one blade pointing down to best lower someone onto the nacelle. And so they've done a variety of kind of exercises that for this to be able to learn and kind of adapt different practices to the turbines. And several projects have done kind of on the water safety exercises with the Coast Guard. But if we go to the next slide, kind of going back to the fairways piece, right? So what you have on the right, so what you have on the left is the image that I just showed you, what they kind of proposed, and the image on the right is the final proposed areas. Unfortunately, the image on the right doesn't show the lease areas. It's a little bit harder to compare, but basically the fairways stayed relatively the same, and what you see in pink is the traffic separation schemes going in and out of the ports, which just have kind of additional regulations in addition to being a fairway, and I can get into that if folks have questions. So just wanted to note, when it comes to navigation, Coast Guard has their authority. They've been exercising it, and folks have been doing different safety protocol to make sure that once the turbines are up, both Coast Guard's missions on navigation and safety can continue to go along. I think that's it, Molly. Did you want to go over this one, or did you want to take this?
Either way, you can take it.
Okay, so we also do safety. So as a trade association, we do safety standards and safety management systems in terms of maintaining offshore safety. And so we take a proactive approach when it comes to managing safety, and look at trying to control for safety risks throughout an entire project life cycle. And so our safety management systems are developing personnel safety training program, emergency response procedures, maritime operations, and inspections and reporting. So there's kind of the industry kind of safety standards, but then there's industry developed safety standard under the ANSI process. So ANSI is the American, I'm forgetting what ANSI stands for, but it's basically a process where you come up via consensus for specific standards. And this is very common in the offshore oil and gas world. It's very common to have API has been doing the American Petroleum Institute has been doing standards for over 100 years in terms of what and a lot of BSEE regulations are based off of those ANSI standards in terms of what is kind of best for the workers and what's happening offshore. And so we use API standards that are relevant, but we also are developing our own that are specific to offshore wind, specifically on turbine and floating structure design, certifying new technology, competency and training standards for offshore workers, emergency response procedures, marine and vessel operations, and others. Next slide. Cool.
Yeah, so this just provided some links here to some of the documents that I've referred to. Of course, the GAO report that came out earlier this year, BOEM's draft PEIS, the environmental assessments for La Humboldt and Morro Bay lease auctions, the AB 525 strategic plan. One I didn't talk about, which is the Ocean Protection Council's work to develop monitoring guidelines for offshore wind, and then the California database and mapping tool. So that is it from us.
Well, thank you very much for the presentations, much appreciated. Now we'll open the floor for questions. We'll begin with Brian.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us, and thanks for the presentation. Great kind of broad broad coverage of all the many issues from soup to nuts here. Kind of zeroing in a little bit on the statement of tasks that our committee's got. We've heard expressed, I'm gonna say concerns related to search and rescue operations in and around the wind arrays. And directed at, in this case, folks who would be there anyway, say, so commercial fishermen or recreational fishermen in the array. But I wonder if you can comment on a couple of those commonly occurring concerns. And specifically, either what mitigation as a best management practice OM suggests to the lessees, or which the industry has standard practices for dealing with, because we know you're gonna have crew boats out there perhaps a lot of the time, if not all the time, and you'll want to be doing monitoring in the arrays, the lessees will, and all of that sort of stuff. So, sort of those concerns usually boil down to radar disruption of environmental data. So that's the over the horizon radar that we use to get wind and wave data into our search and rescue systems. The danger to helicopters conducting searches for either disabled vessels or a person in the water. And that's not just the hoisting, it's also the flying low enough to be able to do surface search radar and visual detection. And then I think probably if in addition to the commercial fishing and sort of normal search and rescue stuff, if you have anything you can add for us with regard to the industrial workers that'll be out there doing all this maintenance, because most of the data we've seen in literature review suggests that most of the search and rescue that does occur is related to typical occupational hazards, slips, trips, falls, and then medical conditions among workers, right? If you have people, you're gonna have people problems, and I wonder what the posture of the industry is towards I would say providing for itself to a degree, not that you wouldn't call on the Coast Guard and other emergency medical services. What does that balance look like generally?
Yeah, I can try and take a first stab, Molly, if you want. Yeah, definitely a lot there. So kind of what I wrote down is questions about radar interference, questions about kind of helicopters during search and rescue, and kind of just like kind of normal like human problems, and how is the industry kind of thinking about helping its own workers. So I guess just starting first with kind of the maybe the helicopter piece. If you guys are ever on the East Coast, I would highly recommend there's a vessel simulator at My Tags, which is in Maryland. I think it's a really great experience to kind of pretend that you're at the helm of a ship in a simulator and drive between the wind turbines, or just drive through turbines. The turbines are about 0.8 to like 1 nautical mile, like 0.6 to like 1 nautical mile spacing, and that is quite large in terms of being able to operate a vessel between the turbines and do search and rescue. Now, of course, weather matters, and in terms of like what the weather looks like and being able to do that. But I'll just note that when you're doing search and rescue, we've had at least one case that I know of where someone, capsized their vessel and near a turbine, and they were able to say, "Hey, I'm by turbine, number 4, 3 basically, and can you come get me?" basically. And it was much easier to do the search and rescue because the person had a point of reference that everybody knew, right? Versus, my boat capsized probably X miles offshore, this port. And so that actually really, really helped. And I think there's having structures in the water is actually kind of an aid to navigation, right? In terms of like kind of Coast Guard terms in certain points. In terms of radar interference, there's 2 types of radar interference that I think is important to know. One is kind of like military radar, which in terms of like what we're thinking about, and then there's kind of like the radar on the helm of your boat, right? In terms of like trying to find interference. And those are two different things in terms of like mitigation and what that looks like. There are ways to update your radar in other pieces. I'll admit I'm not an expert, but can get follow up on that. And then your last question about slips, trips, and falls in terms of like human accidents offshore. Yeah, they happen for sure. And we hear about them and talk about them in our safety committees in terms of, you know, kind of best practices and how to improve on them. The developers, for a large part, have kind of their own ability to kind of bring folks in, either through crew transfer vessels or service operation vessels or helicopter services. The Coast Guard has helped, I think, with a couple different operations, but they've made it quite clear that they don't, you know, want to be dependent on, basically, if there are kind of normal, as you say, kind of human accidents that are happening offshore. And so developers have largely planned for that.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up on the helicopter and worker kind of nexus there? Like say, literature review is as good as it is, but looking at some of the data coming off of the North Sea platforms, it seems like there's a consistent sense that the industry should form these helicopter evacuation consortiums, or they do this as a practice. Is that something that the industry here is considering as well? For less than emergent, that's different than, you know, really bad weather and really emergent evacuation, which is clearly you know, might require governmental flight capability.
Yeah, that's a really so it's a common thing in the Gulf of Mexico for like the oil and gas, right? There are emergency response services that like basically all the kind of oil and gas majors like kind of pitch into, right? And have in case something happens. The oil and gas industry is obviously much more mature than the offshore wind industry. So to be honest, I'm not sure is the answer. I think that's something that's under consideration, but it requires kind of multiple folks to kind of pitch in basically to that sort of service. And I don't think the industry is that mature yet.
Okay, and then just last question, I'll stop following up my own questions here, but are there instances either on the East Coast or you know, elsewhere in the industry where either VHF communications, surface search radar, or LiDAR, you know, infrared, have been installed on platforms within the array to sort of, I'm going to say, you know, it's sort of, if the blades are creating radar interference and you can mount below that and give a good picture in the array, that could greatly offset. Is that a mitigation that you've seen anywhere in the industry?
I'll admit the radar conversation can get quite complex quite quickly, especially depending on which one you're talking about. I don't know the specific technologies off the top of my head, but could get back to you.
Okay, great.
The other thing I wanted to add, and Claire, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of your initial questions was like, well, what about the risk to helicopters trying to land like within an array if that ends up being necessary? And some concerns of like, is it even, how could it ever be safe to try to land like with a spinning turbine? But we have heard, you know, anecdotally there is, I mean, of course, there are mechanisms to do emergency curtailment where you stop blades spinning if there is like a real emergency situation where you have to be landing right within the zone of an otherwise spinning turbine.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Thank you.
Jeremy? Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. So we've heard, and I also sort of see in my own research that there are issues at times with engagement and perceptions of trust and transparency of both developers and BOEM. So my question is, what do you think developers and BOEM are doing well? Where could they do a better job, given the constraints of the present system that we're all operating under? And what kinds of policies or changes might go a long way towards improving those aspects?
Yeah, I might I would start off by just saying that the offshore wind industry is one of the most regulated industries in the country. We have not been grandfathered out of any law in terms of like different environmental laws or kind of maritime regulations or other things. There are, just to like give an example, right? The offshore wind industry is subject to vessel speed restrictions, right, to help protect right whales on the East Coast. That means our vessels are going less than 10 knots, right? While we have whale watching boats and NOAA scientific vessels to study the whales that are passing ours, because we are subject to restrictions that no one else is. So there's a huge amount of regulation that the offshore wind industry is subject to that other industries simply aren't. So I'll start with that. In terms of like a lack of transparency, the BOEM website is it can be a little clunky to use, but is a huge resource in terms of all the different construction and operation plans, all the different kind of lease areas, etc., and would highly recommend using it. The Northeast Ocean Data Portal and the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Data Portal also have a huge amount of like kind of great mapping features and layers that I would say is a huge resource to be able to go to and to use that kind of open resource kind of platform in terms of like where the areas are, where the turbines are going to be sited, etc. And would highly recommend checking that out. There's also some great literature from the Northeast again in New England that I can point you towards, but that's maybe kind of less relevant for you guys since you're focused on the West Coast, and I'll let Molly to speak to more kind of West Coast specific stuff. But I'll just note that the offshore wind industry is relatively new, right? And we, especially compared to oil and gas, and BOEM recently did a modernization rule of their regulations around offshore wind to try and make it a bit better and kind of easier to follow, because BOEM is learning as they go in terms of learning how to permit an offshore wind project. And so they're trying to learn as they go and make it better and kind of more efficient. But at the same time, there are kind of some broader needs at play in terms of permitting reform that all industries are currently asking Congress for, that would to make development and reaching kind of the energy needs that we have as a country easier to achieve. So in terms of like what do we need in terms of making that better, permitting reform when it comes to that, and happy to talk about a little bit more about that. We need a bigger pipeline of projects in terms of projects that are kind of going through the system in terms of getting permitted, and kind of a lifting of the presidential memorandum, right, halting offshore wind permitting and leasing. And there needs to be kind of more, the industry needs to be kind of let to continue and grow so that folks can better understand how to permit and kind of implement these projects. But Molly, sorry.
Yeah, well, I will just add on the California side. I mean, I think I pointed out a couple of the lease requirements, such as having fisheries communications plans, Native American tribal communication plans, which really ask those key stakeholders how they want to be communicated with and interacted with. And then the leaseholders are, beholden to follow those communication protocols. So I think there is a lot of engagement. Certainly in the 7C process, there is a ton of active engagement going on. Like, I don't think anyone would say that the offshore wind industry doesn't understand what fishing concerns are, or the fishing industry doesn't understand what the offshore wind industry thinks is like in the realm of possible for mitigating, right? Like, there's so much happening in that. Tribal communications and engagement is sometimes more difficult, and that can be more about the ability and capacity of tribes to be able to devote their unpaid time to engage in these issues when they are far off, and there's a lot of design questions that are still to be determined. So for recommendations, we refer you to some of the reports in the GAO report that came out, including the potential for the federal government to provide some capacity funding for tribes to be able to participate more. The other observation I would share is that I think there can be frustration sometimes when offshore wind developers are talking to stakeholders that have questions, but they don't yet have all of the answers. And it can feel like, oh, are you like withholding something? But it's not that. It's really just the development stage that they're at. They don't have all of the answers about, exactly how far apart turbines will be used, and given your mooring type, exactly like what kind of fishing could occur within the array versus definitely not. Some of those questions are just can't be answered at this time with enough certainty that it's worth trying to make the answer and then be wrong. So this is the beginning, especially for California, and much more so for Oregon and Washington, the beginning of a very, very long development timeline. It'll be probably 10 years till projects are up and running, and so lots and lots of time for engagement, but there's going to need to be some patience in like getting all of the questions answered and concerns addressed across that.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have.
Annette, please.
Yes. Thank you both very much. So what is the expectation of when the referendum will be lifted with regards to offshore wind? What are developers' expectations for that?
Are you referring to the halt on leasing or the halt on federal permitting, or both?
Both.
We don't know. I think is the short answer. Leasing is a little bit more certainly long term, in that while areas can be removed from potential leasing for energy development from the Outer Continental Shelf, putting them back for potential development would require not just presidential action necessarily, but an act of Congress reversing that decision. I have that right, Claire?
Yeah, I mean the presidential memorandum that stops wind leasing, onshore and offshore wind leasing and permitting, is a temporary. It says in the title that it's temporary, and that it's going to be over when the environmental review is done. When that has the environmental review started, when is it going to end? We don't know. Are offshore wind projects already subject to more environmental review than their offshore oil and gas counterparts? Yes. Are they already subject to huge amounts of environmental review from the leasing and construction operation plan process? Yes. So it's unclear.